Chapter 1. It was 10 p.m. The iron gates of the public garden were locked, and Place des Vosges was empty. Glistening tire tracks on the asphalt, the continuous play of the fountains, leafless trees, and the regular shapes of identical rooftops silhouetted against the sky. There were few lights under the splendid arcades encircling the square. Only 3 or 4 shops. Inspector Maigret could see a family eating inside one of them, cluttered with beaded funeral wreaths. He was trying to read the numbers above the doors, but he had barely passed the wreath shop when a diminutive form stepped out of the shadows. "Is it you I just telephoned?" She must have been watching out for a long time, despite the November cold. She had not slipped on a coat over her apron. Her nose was red, her eyes anxious. Less than 400 meters away, on the corner of Rue de Béarn, a uniformed police officer stood guard. "Didn't you inform him?" grumbled Maigret. "No, because of Madame de Saint-Marc, who's about to give birth." "Oh, look, there's the doctor's car. He was asked to come straight away." There were 3 cars drawn up alongside the pavement, headlamps on, red rear lights, the sky, with its drifting clouds against a moonlit backdrop, had an ambiguous paleness. It felt as if the first snows were in the air. The concierge turned under the archway at the building's entrance, from which hung a 25-candle-power bulb covered in a film of dust. "Let me explain. This is the courtyard. You have to cross it to get to all parts of the building, except for the 2 shops. This is my lodge on the left. Take no notice. I didn't have time to put the children to bed. There were 2 of them, a boy and a girl, in the untidy kitchen, but the concierge didn't go inside." She pointed to a long building at the far end of the vast and beautifully proportioned courtyard. "It's there. You'll see." Maigret was intrigued by this curious little woman, whose restless hands betrayed her febrility. "There's someone on the phone asking for a detective chief inspector," he had been told earlier at Quai des Orfèvres. The voice on the other end was muffled. Several times he had repeated, "Please speak up. I can't hear you. I can't. I'm calling you from the tobacconist's." "So," and a garbled message followed, "you must come to 61 Place des Vosges right away." "Yes, I think it's a murder, but don't tell anyone yet." And now the concierge was pointing at the tall first-floor windows. Behind the curtains, shadows could be seen coming and going. "It's up there, the murder. No, Madame de Saint-Marc, who's giving birth. Her first. She's not very strong. You understand?" And the courtyard was even darker than Place des Vosges. It was illuminated by a single lamp on the wall. A staircase could just be made out on the other side of a glazed door, and there was the occasional lighted window. "What about the murder? I'm coming to that Couchet's workers left at 6 o'clock. Wait a moment. What is Couchet?" "The building at the far end. A laboratory where they make serums. You must have heard of Dr. Riviere's serums. And that lighted window. Wait, today's the 30th. So, Monsieur Couchet was there. He's in the habit of staying behind on his own after the offices have closed. I saw him through the window, sitting in his armchair. Look, a window with frosted glass panes. A strange shadow, like that of a man slumped forward on his desk." "Is that him?" "Yes, around 8 o'clock, when I was emptying my rubbish bin. I glanced over in that direction. He was writing. You could clearly see the pen holder or pencil in his hand." "What time did the murder—" "Just a minute. I went upstairs to see how Madame de Saint-Marc was doing. I glanced over again when I came back down. And there he was, as he is now, Actually, I thought he dozed off. Maigret was beginning to lose patience. Then, 15 minutes later, yes, he was still in the same position. Get to the point. That's all. I decided to check. I knocked on the office door. There was no answer, so I went in. He's dead. There's blood everywhere. Why didn't you go to the police? The police station is round the corner, in Rue de Béarn. And they'd all have arrived in uniform. They'd have turned the place upside down. I told you that, Madame de Saint-Marc. Maigret had both hands in his pockets, his pipe between his teeth. He looked up at the first-floor windows and had the impression that the birth was imminent, as there was even more toing and froing. He heard a door opening and footsteps on the stairs. A tall, broad shape appeared in the courtyard, and the concierge, touching the inspector's arm, murmured reverentially, "Monsieur de Saint-Marc, he's a former ambassador." The man, whose face was in shadow, paused, started walking again, and stopped once more, constantly glancing up in the direction of his own windows. He must have been sent outside to wait. Already, earlier on, come. Oh no, there they go again with their gramophone, and right above the Saint-Marcs, too, a smaller window, on the second floor, not so brightly lit. It was closed, and you could imagine, rather than hear, the music from a gramophone. The concierge, all obsequious, jittery, red-eyed, her fingers twitching, walked to the far end of the courtyard, pointed to a short flight of steps, a half-open door. You'll see him, on your left. I'd rather not go in there again. An ordinary office, light-colored furniture, plain wallpaper, and a man in his mid-40s, sitting in an armchair, his head on the scattered papers in front of him. He'd been shot in the chest. Maigret listened attentively. The concierge was still outside, waiting for him, and Monsieur de Saint-Marc was still pacing up and down the courtyard. From time to time, an omnibus rumbled past, and the racket made the ensuing silence seem all the more absolute. The inspector touched nothing. He simply made sure that the gun had not been left lying around the office, stood surveying the scene for 3 or 4 minutes, puffing on his pipe. Then he left, with a determined air. Well, the concierge was still there. She spoke in hushed tones. Nothing. He's dead. Monsieur de Saint-Marc has just been called upstairs. There was a commotion in the apartment. Doors were slamming. There was the sound of running footsteps. She's so frail. Yes, muttered Maigret, scratching the back of his neck. Only that's not the issue. Do you have any idea who could have entered the office? Me. How would I? Excuse me, but from your lodge at the entrance to the building, you must see the residents coming and going. I ought to. Now, if the landlord gave me a decent lodge and put in proper lighting, I can only just hear footsteps, and, yes, at night I see shadows. There are some footsteps I'm able to recognize. Have you noticed anything unusual since 6 o'clock? Nothing. Nearly all the residents came down to empty their rubbish. The bins are here, to the left of my lodge. Do you see the 4 dustbins? They're not allowed to come down before 7 p.m. And nobody came in via the archway. How would I know? It's obvious you don't know this building. There are 28 residents, not counting the couche laboratory, where people are coming and going all the time. Footsteps in the entrance. Oh, a man in a bowler hat entered the courtyard, turned left, and going over to the dustbins, grabbed an empty bin. despite the darkness. He must have spotted Maigret and the concierge, since he froze for a second and then said, "Nothing for me. Nothing, Monsieur Martin." And Maigret asked, "Who's that?" "Monsieur Martin, a registry office official who lives on the second floor with his wife. How come his rubbish bin?" Nearly all of them do that when they have to go out. They bring the bin down on the way out and pick it up when they come back. Did you hear that? What? It sounded like a baby crying. If only those two up there would turn off that wretched gramophone. They know perfectly well that Madame de Saint-Marc's giving birth. She hurried over to the staircase, which someone was descending. "Well, doctor, is it a boy? A girl?" And the doctor left. He could be heard starting up his car and driving off. Day-to-day life went on. The dark courtyard, the archway and its feeble bulb, the lighted windows, and the vague sound of music from a gramophone. The dead man was still in his office, all alone, his head resting on scattered papers. Suddenly, there was a scream from the second floor, a piercing shriek, like a desperate call for help. But the concierge didn't react. She sighed as she pushed open the door to her lodge. "There goes the madwoman again." Then it was her turn to shout, because one of her kids had broken a plate. The light revealed the concierge's thin, tired face, her ageless body. "When will all the formalities begin?" she asked. The tobacconist's opposite was still open, and a few minutes later, Maigret shut himself inside the telephone booth. He issued instructions in hushed tones. "Yes, the public prosecutor, 61, almost on the corner of Rue de Turenne, and inform the forensics department." "Hello? Yes, I'm remaining at the scene." He walked a few steps and mechanically passed under the archway and ended up standing glumly in the middle of the courtyard, hunching his shoulders against the cold. One by one, the lighted windows went dark. The silhouette of the dead man could still be seen through the frosted glass like a Chinese shadow puppet. A taxi pulled up. It wasn't the public prosecutor yet. A young woman crossed the courtyard with hurried steps, leaving a whiff of perfume in her wake, and pushed open the door to Couché's office. Chapter 2. There was a whole succession of unfortunate moves that resulted in a comical situation. On discovering the body, the young woman wheeled round and caught sight of Maigret's tall form in the doorway. Automatically, she associated two images, a dead man and a murderer. Wide-eyed, her body tensed, she opened her mouth to scream for help, dropping her handbag. Maigret had no time to argue. He seized her arm and put his hand over her mouth. "Shh. You're mistaken, police." Before his words sank in, she struggled and, being highly strung, tried to bite, kicking back with her heels. There was a sound of silk ripping her dress strap. Finally, Maigret managed to reassure her. "Hush," he repeated. "I'm from the police. We don't want to disturb the entire building." Silence, unusual in such situations, was the characteristic of this murder, as was the calmness. The 28 residents all going about their ordinary business, oblivious of the body. The young woman adjusted her clothing and her hair. "Were you his mistress?" She shot Maigret a furious look as she rummaged for a pin to fix her strap. "Had you arranged to meet him this evening, at 8 o'clock, at the Select? We were supposed to be having dinner together and then going to the theater. When he didn't turn up at 8, Didn't you telephone him? Yes, but the phone was off the hook. They both saw it at the same time. On the desk. The man must have knocked it over when he fell forward. Footsteps in the courtyard, where that evening the slightest sounds were amplified, as if under a bell. The concierge called out from the threshold to avoid seeing the body. Detective Chief Inspector, the local police. She did not like them. They arrived in groups of 4 or 5, making no attempt to be discreet. One of them was telling a funny story. Another asked, on reaching the office, "Where's the body?" Since the local police chief was away, his deputy was standing in for him. So Maigret felt even more comfortable taking charge of operations. "Leave your men outside. I'm waiting for the public prosecutor. It is preferable for the residents not to have any idea." And, while the deputy inspected the office, he turned once more to the young woman. "What is your name?" Nine Moynard. "But everyone calls me by my first name. How long have you known Couchet? 6 months, maybe?" There was no need to ask her many questions. It was enough to watch her. A fairly pretty girl, still at the beginning of her career. Her outfit was from a quality fashion house, but her makeup, the way she held her bag and gloves, and the aggressive look in her eyes gave away her music hall background. "Dancer. I was at the Moulin Bleu. What about now?" "I'm with him." She hadn't had time to cry. Everything had happened too fast, and the facts hadn't properly sunk in yet. "Did he live with you?" "Not exactly, because he was married. But your address? Hotel Pigalle, Rue Pigalle." The police station deputy commented, "In any case, no one can claim it was a burglary. Why not? Look, the safe's behind him. It's not locked, but the body is blocking the door." 9, who had taken a small handkerchief out of her bag, sniffed and dabbed at her nostrils. A moment later, the atmosphere changed. Cars screeching to a stop outside. Footsteps and voices in the courtyard. Then handshakes, questions, noisy discussions. The public prosecutor and his investigating team had arrived. The pathologist examined the body, and the photographers set up their equipment. For Maigret, it was an unpleasant wait. After exchanging the obligatory pleasantries, he went outside, his hands in his pockets, lit his pipe, and bumped into someone in the dark. It was the concierge, who could not stand by and let strangers run around her building without finding out what they were up to. "What's your name?" Maigret asked her kindly. "Madame Boursier? Are these gentlemen going to be here long? Look, the light's gone out in Madame de Saint-Marc's bedroom. She must have gone to sleep. Poor thing." Looking up at the building, the chief inspector noticed another light, a cream-colored curtain, and, behind it, a woman's silhouette. She was small and thin, like the concierge. You couldn't hear her voice, but even so, you could tell she was angry. Sometimes she would remain stock still, staring at an unseen person. Then abruptly, she would start speaking, gesticulating, taking a few steps forward. "Who is that?" "Madame Martin. You saw her husband return earlier. You know, the man who picked up his rubbish bin, the registry office official. Are they in the habit of arguing?" "They don't argue. She's the one who shouts. He doesn't dare open his mouth." From time to time, Maigret took a look inside the office where 10 or so people were busy at work. Standing in the doorway, the prosecutor called the concierge. "Who is Monsieur Couchet's second in command?" "The manager, Monsieur Philippe. He doesn't live far away. He's on the Ile Saint-Louis." "Does he have a telephone?" "He's bound to." There was a sound of voices speaking on the phone. Upstairs, Madame Martin's silhouette could no longer be seen against the curtain. However, a nondescript individual came down the stairs, furtively crossed the courtyard, and went out into the street. Maigret recognized Monsieur Martin's bowler hat and putty-colored overcoat. It was midnight. The girls playing the gramophone switched off their lights. Apart from the office, the only light left on was on the first floor, in the St. Marx's sitting room, where the former ambassador and the midwife were conversing in low voices. A faint odor of disinfectant in the air, despite the late hour. When Monsieur Philippe arrived, he was impeccably turned out. His dark, well-kempt beard, his hands gloved in gray suede. He was in his 40s, the epitome of the serious-minded, well-brought-up intellectual. He was certainly astonished, devastated even, by the news, but he seemed somehow to be holding back in his reaction. With the life he led, he sighed. What life? I refuse to speak ill of Monsieur Couchet. Besides, there's no ill to speak of. He was master of his own time. Just a minute. Did Monsieur Couchet manage his company himself? Neither hands-on nor hands-off. It was he who started it up. But once it was up and running, he left me to handle everything, to the extent that sometimes I didn't see him for a fortnight. Take today. I waited for him till 5 o'clock. It's payday tomorrow. Monsieur Couchet was supposed to bring me the money to pay the staff's wages, around 300,000 francs, at 5 o'clock. I had to go, and I left a report for him on the desk. The typed report was still there, beneath the dead man's hand. A mundane report, a suggested rise for one worker in the sacking of one of the delivery men, a draft advert for the Latin American companies, and so on. "So the 300,000 francs should be here?" inquired Maigret. "In the safe. The fact that Monsieur Couchet opened it proves it. He and I are the only two people who have the key and the code. But to open the safe, the body had to be moved, which could not be done until the photographers had finished their job." The pathologist was making his verbal report. Couchet had been hit by a bullet in the chest, which had severed the aorta, and death had been instantaneous. The distance between the killer and his victim was estimated at 3 meters. And lastly, the bullet was of the most common caliber, 6.35 millimeter. Monsieur Philippe explained some things to the examining magistrate. "Here in Place des Vosges, we only have our laboratory, which is behind this office." He opened a door. They glimpsed a vast room with a glazed roof where thousands of test tubes stood in rows. Behind another door, Maigret thought he heard a noise. What's in there? The guinea pigs. And to the right are the offices of the typists and the clerical staff. We have other premises in Pantin, from which most of the dispatching is done. For you probably know that Dr. Riviere's serums are renowned worldwide. Was it Couchet who launched them? Yes, Dr. Riviere had no money. Couchet financed his research. 10 years ago, he opened a laboratory which wasn't as big as this one yet. Is Dr. Riviere still involved? He died 5 years ago in a road accident. At last, Couchet's body was removed. But The moment the safe was opened, there was consternation. All the money it had contained had vanished. Only business documents remained. Monsieur Philippe explained, not only the 300,000 francs that Monsieur Couchet would definitely have brought, but another 60,000 francs held by a rubber band that had been cashed that afternoon and which I myself put in the safe. In the dead man's wallet, nothing. Or rather 2 numbered tickets for a theater near Madeleine, the sight of which made 9 cry. They were for us. We were supposed to be going to the theater. The forensics team was done. There was mounting chaos as the photographers folded up their unwieldy tripods. The pathologist washed his hands at a basin he'd come across in a closet, and the prosecutor's clerk yawned, despite all the goings-on around him. For a few moments, Maigret had a sort of tête-à-tête with the dead man. A vigorous man, on the short side, tubby, like 9. He had doubtless never entirely shed a certain vulgarity, despite his well-cut clothes, manicured nails, and bespoke silk underwear. His fair hair was thinning. His eyes were probably blue and had a slightly childlike expression. A good man, sighed a voice behind him. It was 9, who was crying piteously and who took Maigret as witness, not daring to address the public prosecutor's more formal men. I swear to you, he was a good man. Whenever he thought something would make me happy, and not just me, anybody. I've never seen a man give such generous tips. I even used to scold him. I told him people took him for a ride, and he'd reply, "So what?" Maigret asked gravely, was he a cheerful man? He seemed cheerful, but not deep down, if you know what I mean. It's hard to explain. He needed to be moving, doing something. If he sat still, he'd become broody or anxious. What about his wife? I only saw her once, from a distance. I don't have anything bad to say about her. Where did Couchet live? Boulevard Haussmann. But most of the time, he'd go to Moulins, where he has a villa. Maigret abruptly turned his head, saw the concierge, who did not dare come in. She was signaling to him, looking more unhappy than ever. Listen, he's coming down. Who? Monsieur de Saint-Marc. He must have heard all the commotion. Here he is. Just think, on a day like today. The former ambassador, in his dressing gown, was loath to approach. He had realized this was an investigation by the public prosecutor's office. Besides, the body on the stretcher passed close to him. What's going on? He asked Maigret. A man's been murdered. Couchet, the owner of the serums laboratory. The chief inspector sensed that Monsieur de Saint-Marc had suddenly been struck by a thought, as if recalling something. Did you know him? No. I mean, I knew of him. And nothing, I know nothing. What time did the murder must have been committed between 8 and 9 p.m. Monsieur de Saint-Marc sighed, smoothed his silver hair, nodded to Maigret, and headed for the staircase leading up to his apartment. The concierge had kept her distance. Then she went over to someone who was pacing back and forth under the archway, bent forward. When she came back to Maigret, he asked her, "Who is that, Monsieur Martin?" "He's looking for a glove he dropped. He never goes out without his gloves, even to go and buy cigarettes 50 meters from here." Now searching around the dustbins, Monsieur Martin lit a few matches but eventually gave up and resigned himself to going back up to his apartment. People were shaking hands in the courtyard. The public prosecutor left. The examining magistrate spoke briefly with Maigret. "I'll leave you to get on with your job. Naturally, you'll keep me posted." Monsieur Philippe, still looking as though he'd stepped out of the pages of a fashion magazine, bowed to the detective chief inspector. "You no longer need me. I'll see you tomorrow. You'll be at your office, I suppose, at 9 on the dot, as usual." Suddenly, there was a moving scene, even though nothing particular happened. The courtyard was still plunged in shadow, a single lamp, and then the archway with its dusty light bulb. Outside, cars revved up and glided over the asphalt, briefly picking out the trees of the Place des Vosges with their headlamps. The body was no longer there. The office looked as if it had been ransacked. Nobody had thought to switch off the lights, and the laboratory was lit up as if in anticipation of a hard night's work. And now there were 3 of them left in the middle of the courtyard, 3 very different people who an hour earlier had not known each other and who now seemed to be drawn to each other by an inexplicable kinship. Or rather, they were like the family members who remain behind after a funeral when the rest of the guests have left. At least this was Maigret's fleeting impression, as he looked from Nine's exhausted face to the concierge's drawn features. "Have you put your children to bed?" "Yes, but they're not asleep. They're anxious. It's as if they can sense what's going on." Madame Boursier had a question she wanted to ask, a question she was almost ashamed of, but which, for her, was capital. "Do you think—" Her gaze swept the courtyard and seemed to pause at each of the dark windows. "That it's one of the residents." And now she was staring at the entrance, at the vast archway with its door constantly open, except after 11 p.m., which led from the courtyard to the street and gave the entire unknown world outside access to the building. Nine, meanwhile, was looking uncomfortable, shooting the inspector covert glances. "The investigation will doubtless answer your question, Madame Boursier. For the time being, one thing seems certain, and that is that the person who stole the 360,000 francs is not the murderer. At least that is probable, since Monsieur Couchet's body was blocking the safe. By the way, were the lights on in the laboratory this evening?" "Wait, yes, I think so, but it wasn't as brightly lit as now. Monsieur Couchet must have switched on a light or two on his way to the toilet, which is right at the back of the building." Maigret went back to Couchet's office and switched off all the lights, while the concierge remained in the doorway, even though the body was no longer there. In the courtyard, the inspector found Nine waiting for him. He heard a noise somewhere above his head, the sound of an object swishing against a window pane, but all the windows were shut, all the lights out. Someone had moved. Someone was watching from the shadows of a room. "See you tomorrow, Madame Boursier. I'll be here before the office opens." "I'll follow you. I have to lock the main door." Nine, standing on the edge of the pavement, remarked, "I thought you had a car." She seemed reluctant to leave him. Looking at her feet, she added, "Whereabouts do you live?" "Very close by. Boulevard Richard Lenoir. The last metro's gone, hasn't it?" "I think so. I'd like to tell you something." "Go ahead." She still did not dare meet his eye. Behind them, they could hear the concierge bolting the door, and then her footsteps echoing as she went back to her lodge. There was not a soul in the square. The fountains were babbling. The town hall clock struck 1. "You're going to think that I'm imposing on—" "I don't know what you'll think. I told you that Raymond was very generous. He wasn't aware of the value of money. He used to give me anything I wanted. Do you understand? And it's stupid. I asked for as little as possible. I'd wait until he thought of it. In any case, since he was with me nearly all the time, I didn't need anything. Tonight I was supposed to be having dinner with him. Well, broke. It's not even that, she protested. It's even more stupid. I was thinking of asking him for some money this evening. At lunchtime, I paid a bill. This was excruciating for her. She kept an eye on Maigret, ready to clam up at the slightest hint of amusement. It never occurred to me that he wouldn't show up. I had a little money left in my bag. While I was waiting for him, at the Select, I ate oysters, and then lobster. I telephoned. It was only when I got here that I realized I only had enough to pay my taxi fare. And at home, I live in a hotel. I'm asking if you have any money saved up. Me, a nervous little laugh. What for? How could I have known? Even if I had, I wouldn't have wanted. Maigret sighed. Walk with me to Boulevard Beaumarchais. That's the only place you'll find a taxi at this hour. What are you going to do? Nothing. She shivered. True. She was dressed only in silk. Had he not made a will? How would I know? Do you think people worry about such things when everything's fine? Raymond was a good man. She wept silently as she walked. The inspector slipped a 100-franc note into her hand, flagged down a passing car, and thrusting his fists in his pockets, muttered, "See you tomorrow. You did say Hotel Pigalle, didn't you?" When he got into bed, Madame Maigret woke up only long enough to murmur, sleepily, "Did you at least have dinner?" Chapter 3. Leaving home at around 8 a.m., Maigret had to choose between 3 pressing tasks: revisiting the premises at Place des Vosges and questioning the staff, paying a visit to Madame Couchet, who had been apprised of events by the local police, and lastly, questioning 9 again. On waking, he had telephoned police headquarters and given them the list of residents at number 61, as well as all the people connected either closely or remotely with the tragedy, so that when he went to his office, detailed information would be waiting for him. The market on Boulevard Richard Lenoir was in full swing. The weather was so cold that the inspector turned up the velvet collar of his overcoat. Place des Vosges was close by, but he had to walk there. A tram going to Place Pigalle rumbled past, and that prompted Maigret to make up his mind. He would see 9 first. Of course, she was not up yet. The hotel receptionist recognized Maigret and expressed concern. "She's not mixed up in any trouble." "I hope such a quiet girl. Does she have many visitors?" "Only her friend. The old one or the young one?" "She only has one. He's neither young nor old." It was a comfortable hotel with a telephone in each room and a lift. Maigret was deposited on the 3rd floor. He rapped on the door of room 27, heard someone thrashing around in bed, and then a voice stammer, "What is it?" "Open the door. 9. A hand must have emerged from under the blankets and unbolted the door. Maigret entered the damp gloom, glimpsed the young woman's tired face, and went to draw the curtains. "What time is it?" "Not yet 9. Don't get up." She half closed her eyes because of the harsh light. In that state, she wasn't pretty and looked more like a country girl than a coquette. She ran her hand over her face a couple of times, eventually sat up in bed and placed a pillow behind her. Finally, she picked up the telephone. "Bring my breakfast." And to Maigret, "What a business. You're not too mad at me for scrounging off you last night. It's stupid I'll have to sell my jewelry." "Have you got a lot?" She gestured towards the dressing table, where a few rings, a bracelet, and a watch lay in a promotional ashtray. Their combined value was around 5,000 francs. There was a knock at the door of the next room, and Nine pricked up her ears, gave a vague smile as the knocking began again, more insistent this time. "Who is that?" asked Maigret. "My neighbors, I don't know. But if anyone manages to wake them up at this hour—" "What do you mean?" "Nothing. They're never up before 4 o'clock in the afternoon. That's when they wake up." "Do they take drugs?" Her eyelashes fluttered a yes. But she hastened to add, "You're not going to use what I tell you, are you?" The door eventually opened, as did Nine's, and a chambermaid brought in the tray with the coffee and croissants. "May I?" There were dark circles under her eyes, and her nightdress revealed scrawny shoulders and small, not very firm breasts like those of a stunted child. As she dunked pieces of croissant in her café au lait, she continued to listen out, as if, despite everything she did, take an interest in what was going on next door. "Will I be mixed up in all this?" she asked, nevertheless. "It would be awkward if they wrote about me in the newspapers, especially for Madame Couchet." And, as someone was knocking on her door with urgent little taps, she shouted, "Ye, come in." A woman in her early 30s, who had slipped a fur coat over her nightdress and was barefoot, entered. She almost retreated on catching sight of Maigret's broad back. Then she plucked up her courage and stammered, "I didn't know you had company." Maigret shuddered at the sound of the languid voice that seemed to be struggling out of a furred mouth. He looked at the woman who was closing the door behind her and saw a face drained of color, with puffy eyelids. A glance at Nine confirmed his guess. She was the drug addict from next door. "What's happened?" "Nothing. Roger has a visitor, so I took the liberty." She sat down on the end of the bed, dazed, and sighed, as Nine had done. "What time is it?" "9 o'clock, said Maigret. Someone's been at the cocaine." "It's not cocaine. It's ether. Roger says it's better, and that—" She was cold. She got up to go and huddle by the radiator, gazing out of the window. It's going to rain again. The whole scene was gloomy, depressing. The comb on the dressing table was full of broken hairs. 9 stockings lay on the floor. "I'm in the way, aren't I? But apparently it's important. It's about Roger's father, who's just died." Maigret watched 9 and saw her suddenly knit her brow like someone who has just had an idea. At the same time, the woman who had just spoken raised her hand to her chin, thought for a moment, and muttered, "Oh my goodness." And the inspector asked, "Do you know Roger's father?" "I've never seen him, but—" "Hold on, 9. Nothing happened to your friend, did it?" 9 and the inspector exchanged a glance. "Why?" "I don't know. It's all a bit muddled. I've just remembered that Roger once told me that his father was a visitor here. It amused him, but he preferred not to bump into him, and one time, when he heard someone coming up the stairs, he rushed back into the room. I seem to recall that the person in question came in here." 9 stopped eating. The tray on her knees hindered her, and her face betrayed her anxiety. "His son," she said slowly, staring at the dull glass rectangle of the window. "Oh my goodness," exclaimed the other woman. "Then it's your friend who's dead. They say he was murdered." "Is Roger's surname Couchet?" asked Maigret. "He's Roger Couchet, yes." Disconcerted, all 3 fell silent. "What does he do?" continued the inspector after a long pause, during which a murmur of voices in the next room could be heard. "Pardon, what is his profession?" the young woman snapped. "You're from the police, aren't you?" She was flustered. She might hold it against 9 for having lured her into a trap. The inspector's very kind, said 9, poking one leg out of the bed and leaning forward to pick up her stockings. I should have guessed. So then you already knew. Before I came in. I hadn't heard anything about Roger, said Maigret. Now, I'll need you to give me some information about him. I don't know anything. We've been together for barely 3 weeks. What about before? He was with a tall redhead who claimed to be a manicurist. Does he work? The word work created further discomfiture. I don't know. In other words, he does nothing. Is he wealthy? Does he live extravagantly? No. We nearly always have a 6-franc set menu. Does he often talk about his father? I told you. He only mentioned him once. Could you describe his visitor? Have you met him before? No. He's a man. How can I say? To start with, I thought he was a bailiff. That he'd come because Roger was in debt. Is he well dressed? Hold on. I saw a bowler hat, a beige overcoat, gloves. Between the 2 rooms, there was a communicating door, concealed behind a curtain, and probably locked. Maigret could have pressed his ear to it and overheard everything, but he was loath to do so in front of the 2 women. 9 got dressed, contenting herself with wiping her face with a moistened towel by way of a wash. She was on edge. Her movements were jerky. It was clear that she was out of her depth, and now she was expecting all sorts of trouble. She didn't have the strength to react or even to grasp the situation. The other woman was calmer, perhaps because she was still under the influence of ether, perhaps because she had more experience of this sort of thing. What is your name? Celine. Do you have a profession? I was a hairdresser doing home visits. And on the Vice Squad's books. She shook her head, without showing annoyance. A murmur of voices could still be heard coming from next door. 9, who had slipped on a dress, gazed around the room and suddenly burst into tears, exclaiming, "Oh God, oh God." It's a funny business, said Celine slowly. Enfin, if it really is a murder, they're going to keep pestering us. Where were you last night at around 8 p.m.? She cast her mind back. Hold on, 8 o'clock. Well, I was at the Simenon. Was Roger with you? No, we can't be together all the time. I met him at midnight. At the tobacconist's in Rue Fontaine. Did he tell you where he'd been? I didn't ask. Through the window, Maigret could see Place Pigalle, its tiny garden, the nightclub signs. Suddenly, he straightened up and marched towards the door. Wait here for me, both of you. And he went out, knocked at the neighboring door, and turned the handle. A man in pajamas was sitting in the only armchair in the room, which reeked of ether despite the open window. Another man was pacing up and down, gesticulating. It was Monsieur Martin, whom Maigret had met twice the previous evening, in the courtyard at Place des Vosges. Ah, so you found your glove. Maigret was looking at the 2 hands of the official from the registry office, who turned so pale that the inspector thought for a moment that he was about to faint. His lips quivered. He attempted to speak, but failed. I. The young man had not shaved. He had a pasty complexion, red-rimmed eyes, and soft lips that were a sign of his spinelessness. He gulped water out of the tooth mug. Get a grip on yourself. Monsieur Martin, I hadn't expected to meet you here, especially at this hour, when your office must have opened some time ago. Maigret studied him from head to toe. He had to make an effort not to take pity on him. Such was the poor man's visible confusion. From his shoes to his tie and his detachable white collar, Monsieur Martin was like a caricature of the archetypal civil servant, a dignified, neat, and orderly official with a waxed mustache. Not a speck of dust on his clothes, who no doubt deemed it shameful to go out without gloves. Right now, he didn't know what to do with his hands, and his gaze searched the corners of the untidy room as if he hoped to find inspiration there. "May I ask you a question? Monsieur Martin, how long have you known Roger Couchet?" It was no longer fear. It was sheer terror. "Me? Yes. You? Since my marriage." He said this as if it were self-evident. "I don't understand." "Roger is my stepson, my wife's son, and Raymond Couchet was his father." "Well, yes, as—" He grew more assured. "My wife was Couchet's first wife. She has a son, Roger, after she got divorced. I married her." This had the effect of a gust of wind sweeping an overcast sky. The building in Place des Vosges was transformed by it. The nature of the events changed. Some points became clearer. Others, on the contrary, became muddier, more worrying, to such an extent that Maigret no longer dared speak. He needed to muster his thoughts. He looked from one man to the other with mounting concern. That very night, the concierge had asked him, looking up at all the windows that could be seen from the courtyard, "Do you think it's one of the residents?" And her eyes finally came to rest on the archway. She hoped that the murderer had come in that way, that it was someone from outside. Well, it wasn't. The drama was indeed an internal affair. Maigret couldn't have said why, but he was convinced of it. What drama? He hadn't the faintest idea. Only he had a hunch that there were invisible threads linking points far apart in space, stretching from Place des Vosges to this hotel in Rue Pigalle, from the Martins' apartment to Couchet's laboratory, from Nine's room to that of the couple in an ether-induced stupor. Perhaps the most disturbing thing was seeing Monsieur Martin tossed like a hapless spinning top into this maze. He always wore gloves. His putty-colored overcoat alone was an orderly, dignified statement, and his anxious look sought to alight somewhere without success. "I came to tell Roger," he stammered. "Yes." Maigret looked him in the eyes, calmly, deeply, and almost expected to see Monsieur Martin shrink with fear. "My wife told me that it would be best if we were the ones to—" "I understand. Roger is very, very sensitive." Maigret took the words out of his mouth. "An anxious boy." The young man, who was on his third glass of water, glared at him venomously. He must have been 25, but his features were already careworn. His eyelids withered, and yet he was still attractive, with a dark complexion and looks capable of seducing some women. Everything about him was tinged with romanticism, even his weary, slightly nauseated air. "Tell me, Roger Couchet, did you see your father often?" "Sometimes." "Where?" And Maigret's eyes bored into him. "At his office or at a restaurant?" "When did you see him for the last time?" "I don't know. A few weeks ago." "And did you ask him for money?" "As always." "In other words, you were sponging off him." "He was wealthy enough to—" "Just a moment. Where were you at around 8 p.m. last night?" There was no hesitation. "At the Select," he said, with an ironic smile that meant, "Don't you think I can't see where this is leading?" What were you doing at the Select? I was waiting for my father. So, you needed money, and you knew that he'd be coming to the Select. He was there nearly every evening with his mistress. And anyway, that afternoon, I overheard her talking on the telephone. You can hear everything through these walls. When you realized that your father wasn't coming, did it occur to you to go to his office in Place des Vosges? No. Maigret picked up a photograph of the young man from the mantelpiece. It was surrounded by portraits of different women. He put it in his pocket, mumbling, "May I, if you wish?" "You don't think," began Monsieur Martin. "I don't think anything at all, which reminds me, I'd like to ask you some questions. How were relations between your household and Roger? He didn't come often, and when he did come, he only stayed for a few minutes. Is his mother aware of his lifestyle? What do you mean? Don't pretend to be stupid, Monsieur Martin. Does your wife know that her son lives in Montmartre and is a layabout?" And the civil servant looked at the floor, embarrassed. "I have often tried to persuade him to get a job," he sighed. This time, the young man started drumming impatiently on the table. "You can see that I'm still in my pajamas, and that, would you tell me if you saw anyone you knew at the Select last night? I saw 9. Did you say anything to her? What, I have never spoken to her. Where was she sitting? The second table to the right of the bar. Where did you find your glove? Monsieur Martin, if my memory serves me correctly, you were looking for it last night in the courtyard, near the dustbins." Monsieur Martin gave a strained little laugh. "It was at home, can you believe it? I had gone out with only one glove on, and I hadn't noticed. When you left Place des Vosges, where did you go?" "I went for a walk along the embankment. I had a very bad headache." "Do you often go out for a walk at night without your wife?" "Sometimes." This was agony for him, and he still didn't know what to do with his gloved hands. "Are you going to your office now?" "No. I telephoned to ask for the day off. I can't leave my wife and—" "Well, go back to her." Then, Maigret stayed put. The man was casting around for a dignified way of making his exit. "Goodbye, Roger." He gulped. I think you should go and see your mother." But Roger merely shrugged and gave Maigret an irritated look. Monsieur Martin's footsteps could be heard fading on the stairs. The young man said nothing. His hand automatically picked up a bottle of ether from the bedside table and set it down further away. "You have nothing to say?" the inspector asked slowly. "Nothing." "Because, if you do want to make a statement, you'd better do so now rather than later." "I won't have anything to say to you later." "No, actually I will. One thing I'll tell you right now is that you're barking up the wrong tree. By the way, since you didn't see your father last night, you must be short of money. Too true. Where are you going to find some? Oh, please don't worry about me. Do you mind?" And he ran some water into the basin and started washing. Maigret, to keep his countenance, took a few more steps and then left the room. He went next door, where the 2 women were waiting. Now, it was Céline who was the most anxious. 9 was sitting in the wing chair, slowly nibbling at a handkerchief and staring at the blank window with her big dreamy eyes. "Well?" asked Roger's mistress. "Nothing, you can go back to your room. Is it really his father who—" And suddenly, she frowned. "So does that mean he's going to inherit?" Looking pensive, she left, outside on the pavement. Maigret asked 9, "Where are you going?" A vague, dismissive wave. Then, "I'm going to the Moulin Bleu to see if they'll take me back." He watched her with avuncular interest. Were you fond of Couchet? I told you yesterday. He was a good man, and there aren't many of those around. I can assure you, to think that some bastard. There were a couple of tears, then nothing. It's here, she said, pushing open a little door that was the stage entrance. Maigret was thirsty and went into a bar for a beer. He had to go to Place des Vosges. The sight of a telephone reminded him that he hadn't yet dropped into Quai des Orfèvres, and that there might be urgent post waiting on his desk. He called the office boy. Is that you? Jean nothing for me. What a lady who's been waiting for an hour in mourning. It's not Madame Couchet. What, Madame Martin? I'm on my way. Madame Martin in mourning. And she'd been waiting for him at police headquarters for an hour. All Maigret had seen of her so far was a shadow puppet, the comical, gesticulating shadow on the second-floor curtain the previous evening, whose mouth opened and shut, emitting a furious invective. It happens all the time, the concierge had told him. And the poor civil servant, who'd forgotten his glove and gone for a solitary walk along the dark banks of the Seine. And when Maigret had left the courtyard, at 1 a.m., he'd heard a noise at a window. He slowly climbed the dusty stairs, shook hands with a few colleagues in passing, and put his head around the half-open door of the waiting room. 10 green velvet armchairs, a table like a billiards table on the wall, the roll of honor, 200 portraits of inspectors killed in the line of duty. In the center chair, a lady in black sat very stiffly, one hand clutching her handbag with its silver clasp, the other resting on the handle of an umbrella. Thin lips, a steady gaze staring straight ahead. She did not move a muscle on sensing that she was being watched. She sat and waited with a set expression. Chapter 4. She walked ahead of Maigret with that aggressive dignity of those for whom mockery is the worst calamity. Please, sit down, madame. It was a clumsy, friendly Maigret, with a slightly vague look in his eyes, who showed her into his office, indicating a chair bathed in light, streaming in through the pale oblong window. She sat down, adopting exactly the same pose as in the waiting room, a dignified pose, naturally, a fighting posture too. Her shoulders did not touch the back of the chair, and her black-gloved hand was poised to gesticulate without letting go of the handbag, which would swing through the air. He, on the other hand, sat in an armchair. It was tilted back, and he sprawled in a rather crude position, puffing avidly on his pipe. I imagine, Detective Chief Inspector, that you are wondering why I... No. It wasn't malice that made Maigret throw her off balance like that the minute they met. It wasn't a coincidence either. He knew it was necessary. Madame Martin jumped, or rather her chest stiffened. What do you mean I don't imagine you were expecting? Oh yes, I was, and he smiled at her good-naturedly. Suddenly, her fingers were ill at ease in her black woolen gloves. Her sharp gaze swept the room, and then something occurred to Madame Martin. Have you received an anonymous letter? It was a statement as much as a question, with a false air of certainty, which made the inspector smile all the more, because this again was a characteristic trait that fitted in with everything he already knew about the woman sitting in his office. I've not received any anonymous letter. She shook her head dubiously. You won't have me believe. She was straight out of a family photo album. Physically, she was a perfect match for the registry office official she had married. It was easy to imagine them strolling up the Champs-Élysées on Sunday afternoons, Madame Martin's black, twitchy back, her hat always skew-whiff because of her bun, walking with the hurried pace of an active woman, and that jerk of her chin to underline her emphatic words. Monsieur Martin's putty-colored overcoat, his leather gloves and walking stick, and his peaceful, assured gait, his attempts at a leisurely promenade, stopping to gaze at the window displays. "Did you have morning clothes at home?" murmured Maigret, snidely, exhaling a big cloud of smoke. "My sister died 3 years ago. I mean my sister in Blois, the one who married a police inspector. You see that nothing. She was warning him. It was time to make him aware that she wasn't just anyone. She was on edge, because the entire speech she had rehearsed was pointless, and it was the fault of this burly inspector. When did you hear about the death of your first husband? Why, this morning. Like everyone else, it was the concierge who told me you were handling this case, and, seeing as my situation is rather awkward, you can't possibly understand. I think I can. By the way, didn't your son visit you yesterday afternoon? What are you insinuating? Nothing. It's a simple question. The concierge will tell you that he hasn't been to see me for at least 3 weeks. She spoke sharply, the look in her eyes more aggressive. Had Maigret perhaps been wrong not to let her make her speech? "I'm delighted that you've come to see me, as it shows great delicacy, and the mere word delicacy caused something in the woman's gray eyes to change, and she bowed her head by way of thanks. "Some situations are very painful," she said. "Not everybody understands. Even my husband, who advised me not to wear mourning, mind you. I'm wearing it without wearing it. No veil, no crape band, just black clothes." He nodded his chin and put his pipe down on the table. "Just because we're divorced, and Raymond made me unhappy, it doesn't mean that I must." She was regaining her assurance and imperceptibly launching into her prepared speech. "Especially in a large building like ours, where there are 28 households. And what households? I'm not talking about the people on the first floor. And even then, although Monsieur de Saint-Marc is well-bred, his wife's something else. She wouldn't say hello to her neighbors for all the gold in the world, when one has been properly brought up. It's distressing, too. Were you born in Paris?" "My father was a confectioner in Meaux." "How old were you when you married Couchet?" "I was 20. Of course, my parents wouldn't let me serve in the shop. In those days, Couchet used to travel. He stated that he earned a very good living, that he could make a woman happy." Her gaze hardened as she sought reassurance that there was no threat of mockery from Maigret. "I'd rather not tell you how much he made me suffer. All the money he earned, he lost in ridiculous gambles. He claimed he was growing rich. We moved home 3 times a year, and by the time my son was born, we had no savings at all. It was my mother who had to pay for the layette." Finally, she rested her umbrella against the desk. Maigret mused that she must have been speaking with the same sharp vehemence the previous evening when he'd seen her shadow against the curtain. When a man isn't capable of feeding a wife, he has no business getting married. That's what I say, and especially when he has no pride left. I hardly dare tell you all the jobs Couchet's had. I told him to look for a proper position, with a pension attached, in the civil service, for example. At least if anything happened to him, I wouldn't be left destitute. But no, he even ended up following the Tour de France as some sort of dog's body. His job was to organize food for the cyclists, or something of the sort, and he came back without a sou. That's the man he was. And that's the life I had. Where did you live? In Nanterre. Because we couldn't even afford to live in the city. Did you know Couchet? He wasn't worried. Oh no, he wasn't ashamed. He wasn't anxious. He said he was born to make lots of money, and that's what he would do. After bicycles, it was watch chains. No, you'll never guess. Watch chains, which he sold from a stall at fun fairs. Monsieur. And my sisters no longer dared go to the Neuilly fair for fear of coming across him selling his watch chains. Were you the one who asked for a divorce? She modestly bowed her head, but her features remained tense. Monsieur Martin lived in the same apartment block as us. He was younger then. He had a good job in the civil service. Couchet left me on my own, all the time, while he went off gallivanting. Oh, it was all very above board. I gave my husband a piece of my mind. The divorce was requested by mutual consent for incompatibility of temperaments. All Couchet had to give me was maintenance for the boy, and Martin and I waited a year before getting married. Now she was fidgeting on her chair, her fingers plucked at the silver clasp on her bag. You see, I've always been unlucky. At first, Couchet didn't even pay the maintenance money regularly. And for a sensitive woman, it's painful to see her second husband paying for the upkeep of a child who's not his. No, Maigret was not asleep, even though his eyes were half closed and his pipe had gone out. This was becoming more and more harrowing. The woman's eyes started brimming. Her lips began to tremble in a disconcerting manner. No one else knows what I've suffered. I put Roger through school. I wanted to give him a good education. He wasn't like his father. He was affectionate, caring. When he was 17, Martin found him a job in a bank so he could learn the profession. But that's when he met Couchet. I don't know where. And he got into the habit of asking his father for money. Couchet had always refused to give me anything. Mind you, for me, everything was too expensive. I made my own dresses, and I wore the same hat for 3 years. And he gave Roger everything he asked for. He corrupted him. Roger left home to go and live on his own. He still comes to see me from time to time, but he also used to go and see his father. How long have you lived at Place des Vosges? About 8 years. When we found the apartment, we didn't even know that Couchet was in serums. Martin wanted to move out. That was all I needed. If it was up to anyone to move, it should have been Couchet. Shouldn't it Couchet grown rich somehow or other? I'd see him rolling up in a chauffeur-driven car. He had a chauffeur. You know, I saw his wife at her house. I watched her from the street to see what she looked like. I'd rather not say anything. She's nothing special. In any case, despite her airs and graces and her astrakhan coat, Maigret drew his hand across his forehead. This was becoming obsessive. He'd been staring at the same face for 15 minutes, and right now, he felt that he would never be able to get it out of his mind. A thin face, drained of color, with fine features, which seemed set in an expression of resigned suffering. And that too reminded him of certain family portraits, even of his own family. As a child, he had had an aunt, plumper than Madame Martin, but who also complained all the time. When she visited his family, he knew that the moment she sat down, she'd pull a handkerchief out of her bag. "My poor Hermans," she'd begin. "What a life, you'll never guess what Pierre's done now." And she had that same mobile mask, those two thin lips and eyes that sometimes registered a flicker of disarray. Madame Martin suddenly lost her train of thought. She grew flustered. Now, you must understand my situation. Naturally, Couchet remarried. All the same, I was his wife. I shared his early life. In other words, the hardest years. Whereas she's just a doll. Are you saying you have a claim on his estate? Me, she cried indignantly. I wouldn't touch his money with a barge pole. We're not rich. Martin lacks drive. He doesn't know how to put himself forward, and he allows the grass to grow under his feet while less clever colleagues. But even if I had to be a cleaner to make a living, I wouldn't want. Did you send your husband to tell Roger? She didn't blanch, because it wasn't possible. Her complexion remained uniformly ashen, but her gaze clouded. How do you know? And suddenly, indignant. We're not being followed. I hope, tell me that would be outrageous. And if it is the case, I shall have no hesitation in taking this to the highest authority. Calm down, madame. I didn't say any such thing. I ran into Monsieur Martin by chance this morning. But she was still mistrustful, staring at the chief inspector with dislike. I'm going to end up wishing I hadn't come. One tries too hard to do the right thing, and instead of being grateful. I assure you, I'm infinitely grateful to you for coming to see me. She still had the feeling that something was amiss. She felt terrified by this big man with broad shoulders and a hunched neck who was looking at her with innocent eyes as if his mind were completely vacant. Besides, she said shrilly, it's better you hear it from me than from the concierge. You'd have found out one way or another. That you are the first Madame Couchet. Have you seen Madame Couchet number 2? Maigret struggled to repress a smile. Not yet. Oh, she'll weep crocodile tears. Mind you, she'll be all right now, with the millions Couchet made. And suddenly, she began to cry. Her lower lip came up, transforming her face, softening its sharp angles. She didn't even know him when he was struggling, when he needed a wife to support and encourage him. From time to time, a muffled sob, barely audible, escaped from her slender throat encircled by a silk moire ribbon. She rose and glanced around to make sure she hadn't forgotten anything. She sniffed. But none of that counts. A bitter smile beneath her tears. Well, anyhow, I've done my duty. I don't know what you think of me, but I assure you that he would have been hard put to continue if she had not finished the sentence for him. I don't care. I've got a clear conscience. It's not everyone who can say as much. She was missing something, but she didn't know what. She glanced around the room again and shook one hand, as if surprised to find it empty. Maigret had risen to his feet and saw her to the door. Thank you for coming to see me. I did what I felt was my duty. She was in the corridor where inspectors were chatting and laughing. She swept past the group, head held high, without looking round. And Maigret, his door closed, walked over to the window and flung it wide open. Despite the cold, he felt weary, like after a tough criminal interrogation. In particular, he felt that sort of vague unease one feels when forced to consider certain aspects of life one generally prefers to ignore. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't horrifying. She hadn't said anything extraordinary. She hadn't given Maigret any new leads. Even so, the conversation with her had left him with a faint feeling of disgust. On a corner of the desk, The police gazette lay open, showing 20 or so photographs of wanted individuals, most of them faces of thugs, faces that bore the scars of degeneracy. Ernst Strowitz, sentenced in absentia by the Caen tribunal for the murder of a farmer's wife on the route de Bénouville. And the warning, in red dangerous, still armed. A fellow who would not sell himself cheaply. Well, Maigret would have preferred that to all this syrupy grayness, to these family sagas, to this still inexplicable murder, which he found mind-boggling. His head was full of images. He pictured the Martins out for their Sunday stroll, the putty-colored overcoat, and the black silk ribbon around the woman's neck. He rang a bell. Jean appeared, and Maigret sent him to fetch the records of all those connected to the murder case that he had requested. There wasn't much. 9 had been arrested once, only once, in Montmartre, in a raid, and had been released after proving that she did not make her living from prostitution. As for the Couchet boy, he was being watched by the Vice Squad, which suspected him of drug trafficking, but they had never been able to pin anything on him. A call to the Vice Squad. Céline, whose surname was Loiseau, and who was born in Saint-Amand-Montrond, was well known to them. She had a record. They picked her up fairly frequently. "She's not a bad girl," said the brigadier. "Most of the time she's content with 1 or 2 regular friends. It's only when she ends up back on the street that we find her." Jean had not left the room and was signaling to Maigret. "That lady forgot her umbrella." "I know." "Oh, yes, I need it." And the inspector rose with a sigh, went over and shut the window, and stood with his back to the fire in his habitual thinking posture. An hour later, he was able to make a mental summary of the notes he'd received from various departments and which were spread out on his desk. First of all, the result of the autopsy confirming the pathologist's theory. The shot had been fired from around 3 meters away, and death had been instantaneous. The dead man's stomach contained a small amount of alcohol, but no food. The photographs from the Criminal Records Office, located under the eaves of the Palais de Justice, showed that no fingerprint matches had been found. And lastly, the Crédit Lyonnais confirmed that at around 3 p.m., Couchet, who was a well-known customer, had dropped into the bank's head office and withdrawn 300,000 francs in new bills, as was customary on the penultimate day of each month. It was pretty much established that on arriving at Place des Vosges, Couchet had placed the 300,000 in the safe, alongside the 60,000 already in there. And since he still had work to do, he had not locked the safe again, but was leaning against it. The lights in the laboratory suggested that at some point he had left the office, either to inspect another part of the building or, more likely, to go to the toilet. Had the money still been in the safe when he sat down at his desk again? Probably not, for if it had been, the murderer would have had to move the body to open the heavy door and take the wads of cash. So much for the technicalities. But was it a thief and murderer, or a murderer and a thief operating separately? Maigret spent 10 minutes with the examining magistrate, apprising him of the progress to date. Then, since it was just after noon, he set off home, hunching his shoulders. A sign he was in a bad mood. "Is it you who's investigating the Place des Vosges? case?" asked his wife, who had read the newspaper. "It is." And Maigret had a very particular way of sitting down and looking at Madame Maigret, with a mixture of increased affection and a hint of anxiety. He could still picture Madame Martin's thin face, black clothes, and sorrowful eyes, and those tears that had suddenly welled up, then disappeared, as if consumed by an inner fire, only to flow again a little later. Madame Couchet, who had furs, Madame Martin, who didn't. Couchet, who fed the Tour de France cyclists, while his first wife had to wear the same hat for 3 years. And what about the son? And the bottle of ether on the bedside table in Hotel Pigalle? And Céline, who only went on the streets periodically, when she didn't have a regular boyfriend in 9. "You don't look happy. You don't look well. You look as though you're coming down with a cold." It was true. Maigret could feel a tickle in his nostrils, and his head was like cotton wool. "What's that umbrella you've brought in? It's horrible." Madame Martin's umbrella, the Martins' putty-colored overcoat and black silk dress out for a Sunday stroll down the Champs-Élysées. "It's nothing. I don't know what time I'll be back." There are impressions that cannot be explained. Something felt wrong. Something that emanated from the facade itself. Was it the flurry of activity in the shop that made beaded funeral wreaths? Of course! The residents must have clubbed together to buy a wreath. Or the anxiety on the face of the lady's hairdresser on the other side of the archway whose salon faced on to the street. In any case, there was something unsavory about the building that day, and, since it was 4 p.m. and beginning to grow dark, the feeble little lamp under the archway was already lit. Opposite, the park keeper was locking the gates. In the St. Marc's first-floor apartment, the manservant was drawing the curtains, slowly, meticulously. When Maigret knocked at the door of the concierge's lodge, he found Madame Boursier telling the whole story to a Dufayel credit collector in the store's navy blue livery, who wore a little inkwell pendant on a chain around his neck. "This is a respectable residence where nothing has ever happened." "Shh! Here comes the inspector." She vaguely had something in common with Madame Martin, in that both women were ageless and sexless, and both had suffered, or considered they had, except that the concierge seemed more resigned, displaying an almost animal acceptance of her fate. "Jojo, Lily, don't stand in the way. Good evening. Detective Chief Inspector, I was expecting you this morning. What a business. I thought it was the right thing to do, to go round to all the residents to ask them to club together for a wreath. Do we know when the funeral will be? Oh, by the way, Madame de Saint-Marc, you know, please don't say anything to her. Monsieur de Saint-Marc came by this morning. He doesn't want her upset. In her condition." In the dusky light of the courtyard, the 2 lamps, the one hanging in the archway and the one on the wall, threw long yellow lines. "Madame Martin's apartment?" asked Maigret. "Second floor, 3rd door on the right, after the bend." Maigret recognized the window, where a light was on, but there was no shadow against the curtain. A clatter of typewriters could be heard coming from the offices. A delivery man arrived, Dr. Riviere's serums, at the back of the courtyard, right-hand door. "Jojo, leave your sister alone." Maigret started walking up the stairs, Madame Martin's umbrella under his arm. The building had been renovated up to the 1st floor, the walls repainted and the stairs varnished. From the 2nd floor, it was a different world, grubby walls and a rough floor. The apartment doors were painted an ugly brown and had either name cards tacked onto them or little spun aluminum plates. A calling card at 3 francs a hundred. Monsieur and Madame Edgar Martin. To the right, a 3-color braided bell pull with a silk tassel. When Maigret yanked it, a reedy bell rang in the hollowness of the apartment. Then there were rapid footsteps. A voice asked, "Who is it?" "I've brought back your umbrella." The door opened. The entrance hall was reduced to 1 square meter with a coat stand from which the putty-colored overcoat hung. Directly opposite, the open door of a room, part living room, part dining room, with a wireless set on a sideboard. "Forgive me for the intrusion. This morning you left this umbrella in my office." "There you go. And I was convinced I'd left it on the bus. I was saying to Martin." Maigret did not smile. He was used to women who were in the habit of calling their husbands by their surnames. Martin was there, in his striped trousers, over which he'd slipped a chocolate-colored, coarse-cloth smoking jacket. "Do come in." "I wouldn't want to disturb you." "You never disturb people who have nothing to hide. The primordial characteristic of a home is probably its smell." Here, the smell was indistinct, a blend of caustic soda, cooking, and musty old clothes. A canary was hopping about in a cage, occasionally spraying a drop of water. "Offer the detective chief inspector the armchair." The armchair. There was only one. A high-backed Voltaire leather armchair, so dark that it looked black. And Madame Martin, very different from how she had been that morning, simpered. "You'll have a drink, won't you?" "Oh, you must, Martin. Pour an aperitif." Martin was flustered. Perhaps there was nothing to drink. Perhaps they were nearly out. "No, thank you." "Madame, I never drink on an empty stomach. But you have the time." It was sad. So sad that it almost made you want to give up on being a man, on living on this earth, even though the sun shines over it for several hours a day, and there are real birds flying freely. These people didn't seem very fond of light, for the 3 electric bulbs were carefully shrouded in heavy, colored shades that let only the tiniest amount of light through. Caustic soda mainly, thought Maigret. That was the dominant smell. What's more, the surface of the solid oak table was polished as smooth as an ice rink. Monsieur Martin wore the smile of a man entertaining. "You must have a marvelous view over the Place des Vosges, which is the only square of its kind in Paris," said Maigret, who was perfectly aware that the windows overlooked the courtyard. "No. The apartments at the front, on the 2nd floor, have very low ceilings. Because of the architectural style, all the buildings around the square are classed as historical monuments. You know, we can't change anything. Which is a great shame. We've been wanting to put in a bathroom for years," and Maigret had walked over to the window. He casually tweaked the shadow puppet blind and stood stock still, so stunned that he forgot to make polite conversation. Facing him were the Couchet firm's offices and laboratory. From downstairs, he had noticed that there were frosted glass windows, but from up here, he saw that only the lower panes were frosted. The others were clear, transparent, washed 2 or 3 times a week by the cleaning women. There was a clear view of the spot where Couchet had been killed, and of Monsieur Philippe signing the typed letters that his secretary was handing to him one at a time. He could see the lock on the safe, and the communicating door to the laboratory stood ajar. Through the laboratory windows, a row of women in white overalls, sitting at a massive bench, could be seen packing glass tubes. Each woman had a particular task. The first took the bare tubes from a basket, and the ninth passed the neat packages with their patient information leaflets to an office worker. In other words, goods ready to be delivered to the pharmacists. "Pour him a drink anyway," said Madame Martin's voice behind Maigret, and her husband busied himself opening a cupboard with a clinking of glasses. "Just a thimbleful of vermouth, Detective Chief Inspector. No doubt Madame Couchet is able to offer you cocktails." And Madame Martin gave a peeved smile, as if her lips were barbs. Chapter 5. Glass in hand. Watching Madame Martin closely, Maigret said, "If only you'd been looking out of the window yesterday evening. My investigation would be over, because from here it is impossible not to see everything that goes on in Couchet's office." His voice and manner contained no insinuations. He sipped his vermouth and carried on chatting. "I'd even say that this case would have been one of the most unusual instances of witnessing a criminal act. Someone who was present at a murder from a distance, what am I saying, with binoculars, you'd be able to see the lips of the speakers so clearly that you could work out what they were saying." Not knowing what to think, Madame Martin remained guarded, a vague smile frozen on her pale lips. "But also, how upsetting for you, standing at your window, minding your own business, and suddenly seeing someone threatening your ex-husband, even worse. For the scenario must have been more complicated than that. I can picture Couchet all alone, absorbed in his accounts. He gets up and goes to the toilet. When he comes back, someone has ransacked the safe but hasn't managed to get away. But there is one odd detail, which is that Couchet sat down again. True. Perhaps he knew the thief. He speaks to him. He chides him, asks him to hand back the money. The only thing is, I'd have had to be at the window," said Madame Martin. "Perhaps other windows on this floor afford the same view. Who lives on your right?" "Two girls and their mother, the ones who play records every night." Just then came a scream, which Maigret had heard before. He said nothing at first, then murmured, "That's the madwoman, isn't it?" "Shh," said Madame Martin, tiptoeing over to the door. She flung it open, and in the dimly lit corridor, the shape of a woman beating a hasty retreat could be seen. "Old cat," grumbled Madame Martin loudly enough to be heard by the receding figure. Coming back into the room, furious, she explained, "It's old Mathilde, a former cook. Did you see her? She looks like a fat toad. She lives in the room next door with her sister. Who's mad? I don't know which one's the ugliest. The mad one hasn't left her room once in all the years we've had this apartment. Why does she scream like that? Why indeed she screams when she's left alone in the dark? She's afraid, like a child. She screams. I've finally worked out what's going on. From morning till night, old Mathilde roams the corridors. You're bound to come across her lurking behind a door, and when you catch her, she's not even embarrassed. She wanders off with her ugly, placid grin. You don't feel at home here anymore. You have to talk in whispers if you want to discuss private matters. I just caught her at it, didn't I? Well, I bet she's already back. It's not very pleasant, agreed Maigret. But can't the landlord do anything about it? He's done his best to throw them out, but unfortunately, there are laws, to say nothing of the fact that it's both unhealthy and repugnant. Those two old women in one tiny room, I bet they never wash. Maigret had grabbed his hat. Forgive me for having disturbed you. It's time for me to go. Now he had a clear picture of the apartment in his mind. from the doilies to the calendars on the walls. Be very quiet, and you'll catch the old lady at it. That was not entirely the case. She wasn't in the corridor, but behind her half-open door, like a plump spider waiting to ambush her prey. She must have been disconcerted when the inspector greeted her politely as he walked past. Aperitif time found Maigret sitting in the Select, not far from the American bar, where all the talk was of horse racing. When the waiter came over, he showed him the photo of Roger Couchet, which he had borrowed from the young man that morning. "Do you know this young man?" The waiter looked surprised. "That's strange." "What's strange?" "He left not even 15 minutes ago. He was sitting at this table. I wouldn't have noticed him, except that instead of telling me what he wanted to drink, he said, 'Same as yesterday.' But I didn't recall seeing him. So I said, 'Can you remind me what that was?' 'A gin fizz, remember?' And that's the oddest part, because I'm sure I didn't serve a single gin fizz yesterday evening." He stayed for a few minutes, and then he left. "It's strange that you should come in just now and show me his photograph." It wasn't strange at all. Roger had been determined to establish that he had been at the Select the previous evening. As he had told Maigret, he had used quite a clever trick, but his mistake had been to choose a drink that was out of the ordinary. A few minutes later, 9 came in, looking downcast, and sat at the table closest to the bar. Then, spotting Maigret, she rose, dithered, and came over to him. "Did you want to talk to me?" she asked. "Not especially." "Actually, yes, I'd like to ask you a question. You come here almost every evening, don't you?" "Raymond always asked me to meet him here." "Do you have a regular table?" "Over there, where I sat when I came in." "Were you there yesterday?" "Yes." "Why? And do you remember seeing the original of this portrait?" She looked at the photo of Roger and murmured, "But that's my next-door neighbor." "Yes, he's Couchet's son." Troubled by this coincidence, her eyes opened wide as she wondered what it meant. "He came over shortly after you left this morning. I just got back from the Moulin Bleu." "What did he want?" "He asked me if I had an aspirin for Celine, who was ill." "And did they hire you at the theater?" "I have to go there this evening. One of the dancers is injured. If she's not better, I'll stand in for her, and perhaps they'll give me a permanent job." She lowered her voice and went on. "I have the 100 francs. Give me your hand." And that gesture revealed her entire character. She didn't want to give Maigret the money in public. She was afraid of embarrassing him, so she had the note folded into a tiny oblong in the palm of her hand. She passed it to him as if he were a gigolo. "Thank you. You were so kind." She sounded despondent. She looked about her without taking the slightest interest in the pantomime of people coming and going. She gave a wan smile and said, "The head waiter's looking at us. He's wondering why I'm with you. He must think I've already replaced Raymond. This must be awkward for you. Would you like a drink?" "No, thank you," she said discreetly. "If ever you need me, at the Moulin Bleu. My stage name is Eliane. Do you know where the stage door is? In Rue Fontaine?" It wasn't too difficult. Maigret rang the bell of the apartment on Boulevard Haussmann a few minutes before dinner time. The moment he stepped inside, there was an overpowering smell of chrysanthemums. The maid who opened the door walked on tiptoe. She thought the inspector simply wanted to leave his card, and wordlessly she showed him to the room where the body was laid out, draped in black. By the door were numerous calling cards on a Louis XVI tray. The body was already in its casket, which was invisible under all the flowers. In a corner, a tall, very distinguished young man in mourning nodded briefly at Maigret. Opposite him kneeled a woman in her 50s, with coarse features, dressed like a countrywoman in her Sunday best. The inspector went up to the young man. "May I see Madame Couchet? I'll ask my sister if she can see you. You are Monsieur Maigret, the detective chief inspector in charge of the investigation." The countrywoman stayed where she was. A few moments later, the young man returned and steered his guest through the apartment, apart from the all-pervasive scent of flowers. The rooms retained their usual look. It was a magnificent late 19th century apartment. Like most of the buildings on Boulevard Haussmann, vast rooms, slightly over-ornate ceilings and doors, and classy period furniture. In the drawing room, a monumental crystal chandelier tinkled when people walked underneath it. Madame Couchet sat flanked by 3 people, whom she introduced. First of all, the young man in mourning, my brother, Henry Dormoy, barrister. Then a gentleman of a certain age, Colonel Dormoy, my uncle. And lastly, a lady with magnificent silver hair, my mother. And all of them, in mourning, looked extremely distinguished. The table had not yet been cleared of the tea things, and there was toast and cakes. "Please sit down. One question, if I may." "The lady who is sitting with the body, my husband's sister," replied Madame Couchet. "She arrived this morning from Saint-Amand." Maigret did not smile, but he understood. He clearly sensed that they were not overly keen to see the Couchet family turn up, dressed like bumpkins or got up like petty bourgeois. There were the relatives on the husband's side and the relatives on the Dormoy side. The Dormoys were elegant, discreet. For a start, everyone was wearing black, from the Couchets. For the moment, there was only this countrywoman, whose black silk blouse was straining under the arms. "May I have a few words with you in private, madame?" She apologized to her family, who made to leave the drawing room. "Please stay. We'll go into the yellow boudoir." She had been crying. There was no doubt. Then she had powdered her face, and her puffy eyelids barely showed. There was a note of genuine weariness in her voice. "You haven't received any unexpected visits today, have you?" She looked up, vexed. "How do you know?" "Yes, early this afternoon. My stepson came." "Had you met him before?" "Very briefly. He used to go and see my husband at his office. But we ran into him at the theater on one occasion, and Raymond introduced us." "What was the purpose of his visit?" Embarrassed, she looked away. "He wanted to know if we'd found a will. He also asked me the name of my lawyer so he could contact him concerning the formalities." She sighed, by way of an apology for all this unpleasantness. "He's entitled to. I think that half the inheritance goes to him, and I don't intend to stand in his way. May I ask a few personal questions? When you married Couchet, was he already wealthy?" "Yes, not as wealthy as he is today, but his business was beginning to flourish. A love marriage." An enigmatic smile. "You could say so. We met in Dinard. After 3 weeks, he asked me if I'd consent to be his wife. My parents made inquiries." "Were you happy?" He looked her in the eyes and needed no reply. He murmured the answer himself. There was a certain age gap. Couchet had his business. In other words, there was not a great deal of intimacy, Is that so? You ran his household. You had your life, and he had his. I never criticized him, she said. He was a man with a great appetite for life, who needed excitement. I didn't want to hold him back. Weren't you jealous? At first, then I got used to it. I believe he loved me. She was quite attractive, but with no spark, no spirit, rather nondescript features, a soft body, a sober elegance. She probably made a gracious hostess, serving her friends tea in the warm, comfortable drawing room. Did your husband often talk to you about his first wife? Then her pupils contracted. She tried to hide her anger, but realized that Maigret was no fool. It's not for to me to, she began. My apologies. Given the circumstances of his death, I'm afraid I have to be direct. You don't suspect. I suspect nobody. I'm trying to piece together your husband's life and the lives of those around him, his movements and actions during his last evening. Did you know that his ex-wife lived in the building where Couchet had his offices? Yes, he told me. In what terms did he talk about her? He resented her. Then he was ashamed of his feelings and claimed that in reality she was a sad creature. Why sad? Because nothing could satisfy her. And also, you can guess what I mean. She's very grasping. In short, she left Raymond because he didn't earn enough money. So when she found out that he was rich, after she'd ended up the wife of a petty bureaucrat, she didn't try to. No, I don't think she ever asked him for money. It's true that my husband wouldn't have told me if she had. All I know is that for him, every time he bumped into her at Place des Vosges, it was awkward. I think she deliberately waylaid him. She never spoke to him, but she gave him malicious looks. Maigret couldn't help smiling at the thought of those encounters. Under the archway, Couchet getting out of the car, fresh and pink, and Madame Martin, starchy, with her black gloves, her umbrella, and her handbag, her spiteful face. Is that all you know? He was looking for new premises, but it's difficult to find laboratories in Paris. I presume you are not aware of your husband having any enemies. None. Everyone loved him. He was too kind to the point of making a fool of himself. He didn't just spend money. He threw it away. And when criticized, he'd reply that he'd spent enough years counting every sou. Now, he could afford to be generous. Did he often see your family? Very little. They have nothing in common, do they? And different tastes. Maigret found it hard to imagine Couchet in the drawing room with the young lawyer, the colonel, and the stately mother. All this made sense. A strong, fiery, coarse young man who had started out with nothing and who had spent 30 years of his life struggling to make his fortune. He had grown rich in Dinard. At last, he had access to a world that had hitherto been closed to him. A real young lady, a bourgeois family, tea and petits fours, tennis and outings to the country. He had got married to prove to himself that now the world was his, to have a home like those he had only ever seen from the outside. He had got married, too, because he was in awe of this nice, well-brought-up young lady. And then it was the apartment on Boulevard Haussmann with the most traditional trappings, except he needed outside stimulation to see other people, talk to them without having to mind his P's and Q's, go to brasseries, bars, and other women. He loved his wife. He admired her. He respected her. He was in awe of her. But precisely because he was in awe of her, he needed girls like Nine to relax with. Madame Couchet had a question on the tip of her tongue. She was reluctant to ask it. Then she took the plunge, averting her gaze. I wanted to ask you if... It's a delicate matter. I'm sorry. He had girlfriends. I know. He only kept it quiet, and barely, out of consideration. I need to know whether, on that front, there'll be any problems, a scandal. She obviously imagined her husband's mistresses to be like prostitutes in a novel, or screen vamps. You have nothing to be afraid of, smiled Maigret, who was thinking of little Nine with her distraught face and the handful of jewelry she had taken that same afternoon to the Crédit Municipal. There won't be any need to. No, no allowance. She was astonished, perhaps a little put out, because if these women were making no demands, it must be because they were fond of her husband, and he of them. Have you decided on the date of the funeral? My brother is dealing with it. It will take place on Thursday, at Saint Philippe du Roule. A clatter of plates came from the dining room next door. Was the table being laid for dinner? All that remains is for me to thank you and take my leave. I apologize again. And, walking down the boulevard Haussmann, he caught himself muttering as he filled his pipe, "Good old Couchet." The words escaped his lips as if Couchet had been an old friend. And the feeling was so strong that the thought that he had only seen him dead astounded him. He felt as if he knew him literally inside out, perhaps because of the three women first. There'd been the confectioner's daughter in the apartment in Nanterre, despairing at the thought that her husband would never have a proper job. Then the young lady from Dinard, and Couchet's pride and satisfaction at becoming the nephew of a colonel. 9. Their dinners at the select Hôtel Pigalle. And the son who came to sponge off him, and Madame Martin, who contrived to run into him under the archway, hoping perhaps to plague him with remorse. A strange ending. All alone, in the office where he came as seldom as possible. Leaning against the half-open safe, his hands on the table, nobody had noticed or heard anything. The concierge, crossing the courtyard, had seen him sitting in the same place as usual behind the frosted glass, but she was mainly concerned about Madame de Saint-Marc, who was giving birth. The mad woman upstairs had screamed, in other words, old Mathilde, padding around in felt slippers, had been concealed behind a door on the landing. Monsieur Martin, in his putty-colored overcoat, had come downstairs to hunt for his glove by the dustbins. One thing was certain right now. Someone had the stolen 360,000 francs in their possession, and someone had committed a murder. All men are self-centered, Madame Martin had said bitterly, with her pained expression. Was she the one who had the 360 brand-new 1,000-franc notes handed over by the Crédit Lyonnais? Did she now have money? A lot of money. A whole wad of fat notes promising years of comfort, with no worries about the future or about the pension she would receive on Martin's death. Was it Roger, with his puny body, ravaged by ether, and that Celine he'd picked up to molder away with him in the dampness of a hotel bed? Was it 9 or Madame Couchet? In any case, there was one place from which the whole thing could have been witnessed, the Martins' apartment, and there was a woman prowling around the building, loitering in the corridors, listening at every keyhole. I'd better pay old Mathilde a visit, thought Maigret. But when he arrived at Place des Vosges the next morning, the concierge, who was sorting the post, a big pile for the Couchet laboratory, and only a handful of letters for the other residents, intercepted him. "Are you on your way up to the Martins?" "I'm not sure that's a good idea. Madame Martin was taken very ill last night. We had to call the doctor out urgently. Her husband is out of his mind." The laboratory staff were crossing the courtyard on their way to the offices and the lab. At a first-floor window, a manservant was shaking rugs. A baby could be heard wailing, and a nanny was crooning monotonously. Chapter 6. Shh, she's asleep. Come in anyway. Monsieur Martin stood aside, resigned to showing his home in a state of disorder, resigned to showing himself ungroomed, his mustache drooping, a greenish color, which betrayed the fact that it was dyed. He had sat up with his wife all night. He was worn out, listless. He tiptoed over to close the door that communicated with the bedroom, through which Maigret glimpsed the foot of the bed and a bowl on the floor. "The concierge told you," he whispered, glancing anxiously at the door. As he spoke, he turned off the gas ring on which he had been making coffee. "Some coffee?" "No, thank you. I shan't disturb you for long. I wanted to inquire after Madame Martin." "You're too kind," said Martin emphatically. He really did not suspect any ulterior motive. He was so distraught that he must have lost his critical faculties, although it was not certain he had ever possessed any. "It's terrible. These attacks she has. Would you excuse me for drinking my coffee in front of you?" He grew flustered on noticing that his braces were flapping against his calves. He hastily adjusted his clothes and removed the bottles of medicine that were sitting on the table. "Does Madame Martin often suffer these attacks?" "No, and especially not as violent as this. She's very highly strung. When she was a girl, apparently she had nervous fits every week, and still does." Martin gave him a hangdog look, barely daring to admit, "I have to make allowances for her. One little disagreement and she's seething." With his putty-colored overcoat, carefully waxed mustache, and leather gloves, he had been ridiculous, a caricature of the pretentious petty official. But now the dye had faded from his mustache. The look in his eyes was that of a defeated man. He hadn't had the time to shave, and was still wearing his nightshirt under an old jacket. And he cut a pathetic figure. He was, astonishingly, at least 55. Did something upset her last night? No. No. He became agitated, looking about him, panic-stricken. No one came to see her. Her son, for example. "No, you came. Then we had dinner. And then, what? Nothing. I don't know. It just came over her. She's very sensitive. She's had so much unhappiness in her life." Did he really believe what he was saying? Maigret sensed that Martin was trying to convince himself. "In short, you personally have no ideas about the murder." And Martin dropped the cup he was holding. Was he of a nervous disposition too? "Why would I have any ideas, I swear? If I did, I don't know. It's a terrible business, just when we're inundated at the office. I haven't even had the time to inform my boss this morning." He wiped his thin hand across his forehead, then busied himself picking up the pieces of broken china. He spent ages looking for a cloth to clean the wooden floor. If only she'd listened to me, we wouldn't have stayed here. He was afraid. That was patent. He was beside himself with fear. But fear of what? Fear of whom? "You're a good man, aren't you, Monsieur Martin? And an honest man. I have 32 years' service, and so if you knew something that could help the police unmask the culprit, you would feel duty-bound to tell me." were his teeth chattering. I would most definitely do so, but I don't know anything. And I too would like to know. This is no life. What do you think of your stepson? Martin stared at Maigret in amazement. Roger, he's depraved. I know, but he's not a bad boy. I swear. It's all his father's fault. As my wife always says, you shouldn't give young people so much money. She's right. And as she says, I don't think Couchet did it out of generosity or fatherly love. He had no interest in his son. He did it to get rid of him, to salve his conscience. His conscience. Martin turned red and became even more flummoxed. He treated Juliet badly. Didn't he? He said quietly. Juliet, my wife, his first wife. What did he ever do for her? Nothing. He treated her like a skivvy, and she was the one who helped him through the hard times. And later, he didn't give her anything, obviously, but she had remarried. Martin's face had turned beetroot. Maigret watched him with amazement and pity, for he realized that the poor man was in no way to blame for this staggering story. He was merely repeating what he must have heard hundreds of times from his wife. Couchet was rich. She was poor. And so... But the civil servant was straining to listen. Did you not hear something? They kept quiet for a moment. A faint cry was heard coming from the bedroom. Martin went over and opened the door. What are you telling him? Asked Madame Martin. But, I say, it's Inspector Maigret, isn't it? What does he want now? Maigret couldn't see her. The voice was that of someone lying in bed, very weary, but who still has all her wits about her. The detective chief inspector came to inquire after you. Tell him to come in. Wait, pass me a wet towel and the mirror and the comb. You'll get yourself all upset again. Hold the mirror straight. Will you? No. Put it down. You're hopeless. Take away that bowl. Honestly, men. As soon as their wife's not there, the place looks like a pigsty. You can show him in now, like the dining room. The bedroom was drab and cheerless, furnished in poor taste with a profusion of old curtains, old fabrics, and faded rugs. The minute he stepped inside, Maigret felt Madame Martin's eyes boring into him. Her gaze was calm and extraordinarily clear. Her drawn face broke into an invalid's syrupy smile. The place is a terrible mess. Please don't take any notice, she said. It's because I was taken ill. And she stared mournfully in front of her. But I'm feeling better. I must be back on my feet tomorrow. For the funeral. It is tomorrow. Isn't it? Yes, it's tomorrow. You're prone to these attacks. I had them even as a child. But my sister, the sister who... I had two sisters. Now don't you go believing what's not. The youngest suffered fits too. She got married. Her husband turned out to be a good-for-nothing, and one fine day, when she was having an attack, he had her put away. She died a week later. Don't get upset, implored Martin, who didn't know where to put himself or where to look. Insane? Asked Maigret. The woman's features hardened again, and there was malice in her voice. In other words, her husband wanted to get rid of her. Not even 6 months later. He married someone else. Men are all the same. You devote yourself. You kill yourself for them. I beg you, sighed her husband. I don't mean you, although you're no better than the others. And Maigret suddenly sensed a whiff of hatred in the air. It was fleeting, hazy, but he was convinced he was not mistaken. All the same, if it weren't for me, she went on, did her voice contain a threat? Her husband busied himself doing nothing to keep up appearances. He counted out drops of a potion into a glass, one by one. The doctor said, I don't give a fig for what the doctor said, but you must. Here, drink it slowly. It's not so bad. She looked at him. Then she looked at Maigret. And finally, she gave a resigned shrug and drank. You haven't really come to inquire after my health, she stated suspiciously. I was on my way to the laboratory when the concierge told me, have you found any clues? Not yet. She closed her eyes to indicate fatigue. Martin looked at Maigret, who rose. Well, I wish you a speedy recovery. You're already much better. She let him leave. Maigret stopped Martin from seeing him out. Please, stay with your wife. Poor fellow. He seemed afraid to stay. It was as if he were clinging to Maigret, because when there was another person there, things were not so dreadful. You'll see, it will turn out to be nothing serious. As he walked through the dining room, he heard a rustle in the corridor, and he caught up with old Mathilde just as she was about to go back into her room. Good morning. She looked at him fearfully, without replying, her hand poised on the doorknob. Maigret spoke quietly. He guessed that Madame Martin was listening. She was perfectly capable of getting out of bed to eavesdrop. As you probably know, I'm the detective chief inspector in charge of the investigation. He already sensed that he would get nothing out of the woman with her placid, moon-like face. What do you want from me? Only to ask you if you have anything to tell me. How long have you been living here? 40 years, she replied curtly. You know everyone. I don't talk to anyone. I thought perhaps that you might have seen or heard something. Sometimes, a tiny clue helps set the police on the right track. Someone was moving around inside the room, but the old woman kept the door determinedly shut. You saw nothing. She did not reply. And you heard nothing. You'd do better to tell the landlord to put the gas in. The gas? Everyone else here has gas, but because he's not allowed to put my rent up, he refuses to install it in my room. He wants to boot me out. He's doing everything he can to force me out, but he'll be leaving before me, feet first. And you can tell him that from me. The door opened a tiny crack, so tiny that it seemed impossible that the fat woman could squeeze through. Then she closed it behind her, and only muffled sounds came from inside the room. May I have your card? Maigret proffered his visiting card, and the butler in a striped waistcoat took it before disappearing inside the apartment, which was extraordinarily light, thanks to its 5-meter-high windows. Such windows have become rare and are only found in the buildings on Place de Vosges and the Ile Saint-Louis. The rooms were vast. From somewhere, the hum of an electric vacuum cleaner could be heard. A nanny in a white uniform with a pretty blue headdress was going from one room to another. She shot the visitor an inquisitive glance. A voice, close at hand. Show the detective chief inspector in. Monsieur de Saint-Marc was in his study, in his dressing gown, his silvery hair carefully smoothed. First he went over and closed a door, through which Maigret had the time to glimpse an antique bed, the face of a young woman on the pillow. Please take a seat. Naturally, you want to speak to me about this terrible couché business. Despite his age, he gave an impression of health and vigor. and the atmosphere in the apartment was that of a happy home, where everything was full of light and joy. I was particularly saddened by this tragedy, which took place at a time of great emotion for me. I am aware of that. There was a little glint of satisfaction in the eyes of the former ambassador. He was proud of having a child at his age. May I ask you to keep your voice down, as I'd rather keep this business from Madame de Saint-Marc. In her condition, it would be unfortunate. But what was it you wanted to ask me? I barely knew this Couchet. I'd caught a glimpse of him crossing the courtyard a couple of times. He belonged to one of the clubs I go to occasionally, the Houseman, but he must rarely have set foot in the place. I just noticed his name in the latest directory. I believe he was quite vulgar, wasn't he? In other words, he was working class. He had struggled to become successful. My wife told me he had married a woman from a very good family, a former school friend of hers. That's one of the reasons why it's better not to tell her. So, you wanted to ask me? The vast windows afforded a view of the entire Place des Vosges bathed in soft sunshine. In the square, gardeners were watering the lawns and flower beds. Drays plodded heavily past. Just a simple question. I know that you were on edge while your wife was in labor, which is only natural, and that several times you came down and paced up and down the courtyard. Did you meet anyone? Did you not see someone heading towards the offices at the back? Monsieur de Saint-Marc thought for a moment, fiddling with a paper knife. Wait, no, I don't think so. Don't forget, I had other things on my mind. The concierge would be in a better position to. The concierge doesn't know anything. And I know. Or rather, but it can't have anything to do with. Tell me anyway. At one point, I heard a noise by the dustbins. I was at a loose end, so I went over and I saw one of the residents from the second floor, Madame Martin. I believe that's her name. I confess, I don't know my neighbors very well. She was rummaging in one of the zinc bins. I remember her saying, "One of our silver spoons must have fallen into the rubbish bin." I asked, "Have you found it?" And she said, quite excitedly, "Yes, yes." Then what did she do? Asked Maigret. She hurried back up to her apartment. She's a jittery little woman who always seems to be running. If I recall, we lost a valuable ring in the same manner. And the astonishing thing is that it was returned to the concierge by a rag picker who'd found it when he was rummaging with his hook. You couldn't tell me roughly what time this incident occurred. That would be difficult. Wait, I didn't want any dinner. But at around 8:30, Albert, my butler, urged me to have something, and since I refused to come to the table, he brought me some anchovy tarts in the drawing room. That was before 8:30. Yes, let us say that the incident, as you call it, took place just after 8 o'clock. But I don't think it is of any significance whatsoever. What is your opinion about this business? There's a rumor going around, apparently, that the murder was committed by someone who lives here. But personally, I refuse to believe it. When you think that anyone can just walk into the courtyard. By the way, I'm going to write to the landlord to request that the main door be locked at dusk. Maigret had risen. I haven't yet formed an opinion, he said. The concierge brought up the post, and, since the door had remained open, she suddenly caught sight of the inspector conversing with Monsieur de Saint-Marc. Poor Madame Boursier, she was all flustered. Her expression betrayed a world of anxieties. Would Maigret be so bold as to suspect the Saint-Marcs, or even simply to bother them with his questions? "Thank you, monsieur, and please forgive my intrusion. A cigar." Monsieur de Saint-Marc had the airs of a gentleman, with a tiny hint of condescending familiarity more suggestive of the politician than the diplomat. "I am entirely at your service." The butler closed the door behind him. Maigret made his way slowly down the stairs and found himself in the courtyard where the delivery man from a department store was trying to find the concierge. In the lodge, there was only a dog, a cat, and the two children busy smearing milk soup all over their faces. "Isn't your mother here?" "She'll be back." "Monsieur, she's taking the post up." In the ignominious corner of the courtyard, near the lodge, there were 4 zinc bins into which, at night, the residents came one by one to throw their household waste. At 6 a.m., the concierge unlocked the main door, and the municipal rubbish collectors emptied the bins into their cart. At night, that corner was not lit up. The only light in the courtyard was on the other side. At the foot of the stairs, what had Madame Martin come down to look for? More or less, at the time when Couchet was killed? Had she taken it into her head to look for her husband's glove? "No," grunted Maigret, struck by a memory. Martin had only brought the rubbish down much later. So what had she been up to? There couldn't have been a lost spoon. During the daytime, the residents are not allowed to throw anything into the dustbins. So what were the pair of them looking for, one after the other? Madame Martin had been rummaging in the bin itself. Martin, on the other hand, had been looking in the area around the bins, striking matches. And by the next morning, the glove had been found. "Did you see the baby?" asked a voice behind Maigret. It was the concierge, who was talking about the Saint-Marc's child with more emotion than about her own. "You didn't say anything to Madame. I hope she mustn't be told." I know. For the wreath. I mean, the resident's wreath. I'm wondering whether we should have it delivered to the undertaker's today, or whether it's the custom only to send it to the funeral. The staff were very generous too. They've collected over 300 francs. And, turning to the delivery man, "What is it?" "Saint-Marc, right-hand staircase, first floor facing, and knock gently." Then, to Maigret, "You should see how many flowers she's received. So many they don't know where to put them all. Most of them have had to be taken up to the servants' rooms." "Won't you come in, Jojo?" "Leave your sister alone." The inspector was still staring at the dustbins. What on earth could the Martins have been looking for in them? "This morning, did you put the bins out as usual?" "No. Since I've been widowed, it's impossible. Or I'd have to take someone on, because they're much too heavy for me. The bin men are very kind. I give them a glass of wine from time to time, and they come into the courtyard to collect them." "So the rag pickers can't rummage through them." "Do you think so? They come into the courtyard too. Sometimes there are 3 or 4 of them, and they make an unholy mess. Thank you for your help." And Maigret left, pondering, either forgetting or not considering it worth his while to visit the Couchet offices again, as he had planned to do earlier in the day. When he arrived at Quai des Orfèvres, he was told, "Someone was asking for you on the telephone, a colonel." But he decided to pursue his hunch. Opening the door of the inspector's office, he called out, "Lucas, I want you to get on to this straight away. Question all the rag pickers who operate around the Place des Vosges." If necessary, go as far as the Saint-Denis plant, where the rubbish is incinerated. But we need to know if they noticed anything unusual in the dustbins of 61 Place des Vosges the morning before yesterday. He slumped in his armchair, and a word came back into his mind. Colonel. What colonel? He didn't know any colonels. Oh, yes, he did. There was one colonel in this case, Madame Couchet's uncle. What on earth did he want? Hello, Élysée, 1762. This is Detective Chief Inspector Maigret from Police Headquarters. Excuse me, Colonel Dormoy wants to speak to me. I'll hold the line. Yes. Hello, is that you? Colonel. How? A will. I can't hear you very well. No. On the contrary, lower your voice. Hold the receiver a little further away. That's better. So you have found a will that no one knew about, and not even stamped. Understood. I'll be with you in half an hour. No, there's no point my taking a taxi. And he lit his pipe, pushed back his armchair, and crossed his legs. Chapter 7. The colonel is waiting for you in Monsieur's bedroom. Please follow me. The room where the body had been laid out was closed. There was someone moving around next door, which must have been Madame Couchet's bedroom. The maid opened a door, and Maigret glimpsed the colonel standing by the table, his hand resting lightly on it, his chin high, dignified and calm, as if he were posing for a sculptor. Please sit down. Maigret ignored his invitation to sit and simply unbuttoned his heavy overcoat, placed his bowler hat on a chair, and filled his pipe. Did you find the will yourself? He then asked, looking about him with curiosity. Indeed I did, earlier today. My niece doesn't know about it yet. I have to say that it is so shocking. A strange bedroom. Typical of Couchet True. The furniture was period, like the rest of the apartment. There were a few items of value, but mixed in with them were things that revealed the man's vulgar tastes. Bichoy. In front of the window was a table that pretty much served as his desk. On it were Turkish cigarettes and also a whole set of cheap cherry wood pipes, which Couchet must have seasoned lovingly, a purple dressing gown, the gaudiest he could have found. Then, at the foot of the bed, slippers with holes in their soles. The table had a drawer. Note that it wasn't locked, said the colonel. I don't even know if there is a key. This morning, my niece needed cash to pay a supplier, and I wanted to save her the trouble of writing a check. I searched this room, and this is what I came across. An envelope with the Grand Hotel crest, pale blue notepaper with the same letterhead. Then a few lines that appeared to have been written distractedly, like a rough draft. This is my last will and testament. And further down, these surprising words. Since I shall probably not get around to finding out about inheritance law, I instruct my lawyer, Maître Dampierre, to do his utmost to ensure that my fortune is shared as equally as possible between my wife Germaine, née Dormoy, 2, my first wife, now Madame Martin, residing at 61 Place des Vosges, 39 Moinard, residing at Hôtel Pigalle, Rue Pigalle. What do you make of that? Maigret was jubilant. This will endear Couchet to him even further. Naturally, continued the colonel, this will does not hold water. There are numerous reasons why it would be deemed null and void, and immediately after the funeral, we intend to contest it. But the reason I felt it was useful and urgent to discuss it with you is that Maigret was still smiling. as if he had witnessed a good prank. Even the Grand Hotel letterhead. Like many businessmen, Couchet probably held some of his meetings there. So, while waiting for someone, probably in the lobby or the smoking room, he had picked up a blotter and scribbled those few lines. He hadn't sealed the envelope. He'd stuffed the whole thing in his drawer, postponing the business of having a proper will drawn up. That had been 2 weeks ago. You must have been struck by one outrageous detail, the colonel was saying. Couchet simply doesn't mention his son. That alone is enough to render the will null and void. And, do you know, Roger? Me. No. And Maigret was still smiling. I was saying earlier that if I asked you to come here, it was because, do you know 9 Moynard? The poor man jumped as if someone had stepped on his toe. I don't need to know her. Her address alone, Rue Pigalle, gives me an idea of... Now, what was I saying? Oh, yes. Did you notice the date on the will? It is recent. Couchet died 2 weeks after writing it. He was murdered. Now, imagine that one of the 2 women concerned was aware of these provisions. I have every reason to believe that neither of them is rich. Why 2 women? What do you mean, 3 women? The will names 3 women, Couchet's 3 women, 3 if you like. The colonel assumed that Maigret was joking. I was being serious, he said. Don't forget that there is a dead man in the house, and that this affects the future of several people. Of course, all the same. Maigret felt like laughing. He himself couldn't have said why. Thank you for letting me know. The colonel was vexed. He could not understand this attitude on the part of a police inspector of Maigret's senior rank. I suppose. Goodbye, Colonel. Kindly pay my respects to Madame Couchet. In the street, he couldn't help muttering, good old Couchet. Coldly, just like that, in complete seriousness. He had put his 3 women in his will, including his first wife, now Madame Martin, who was constantly appearing in front of him with her contemptuous gaze, like a living reproof, including courageous little 9, who did everything she could to entertain him. On the other hand, he had forgotten that he had a son. For a good few minutes, Maigret wondered whom to tell first, Madame Martin, who would probably leap out of her bed at the news of a fortune or 9, but they haven't got their hands on the cash yet. This business could go on for years. The family would contest the will. Madame Martin, in any case, wouldn't allow them to push her around. Even so, the colonel has been honest. He could have burned the will, and no one would ever have known. And a light-hearted Maigret crossed the Europe district on foot. A wan sun gave out a little warmth, and there was joy in the air. Good old Couchet? He entered the lift of Hotel Pigalle without announcing himself, and a few moments later, he was knocking at 9's door. He heard footsteps inside the room. The door opened a fraction, just enough for a hand to poke through. The hand remained dangling in the air. A woman's hand, already wrinkled. Since Maigret didn't respond, the hand grew impatient, and the face of an elderly Englishwoman appeared. She launched into an unintelligible tirade, or rather, Maigret guessed that the Englishwoman was expecting her post, which explained the outstretched hand. What was clear was that 9 no longer occupied her room, and that she probably didn't live in the hotel anymore. Too expensive for her, he thought, and he paused uncertainly outside the neighboring door. A valet decided him, asking him suspiciously, "Can I help you, Monsieur Couchet? Is he not answering?" I haven't knocked yet, and Maigret was still smiling. He was in a buoyant mood. That morning, he suddenly felt as if he were playing a part in a farce. Life itself was a farce. Couché's death was a farce, especially his will. Come in. The bolt slid back. The first thing Maigret did was to march over and draw the curtains and open the window. Céline had not even woken up. Roger rubbed his eyes and yawned. "Oh, it's you." There was an improvement. The room didn't reek of ether. The clothes were in a heap on the floor. "What do you want?" Roger sat up in bed, picked up the glass of water from his bedside table, and drained it in one go. "The will has been found," announced Maigret, covering up a naked thigh belonging to Céline, who was lying curled up. "So what?" Roger showed no excitement, barely a vague curiosity. "So what? It's a strange will. It will certainly cause much ink to flow and earn the lawyers a lot of money. Can you imagine? Your father has left his entire fortune to his 3 women." The young man struggled to understand. "His 3? Yes, his current lawful wife. Then your mother, and lastly his girlfriend 9, who was living in the room next door till yesterday. He has instructed the lawyer to ensure they each receive an equal share." Roger didn't bat an eyelid. He appeared to be thinking, but not to be thinking about something that concerned him personally. "That's priceless," he said at length in a serious tone that belied his words. "That's exactly what I said to the colonel." "What colonel?" "An uncle of Madame Couché's. He's playing the head of the family. I bet he's not happy. Too right." The young man thrust his legs out of the bed and grabbed a pair of trousers draped over the back of a chair. "You don't seem particularly bothered by this news." "Oh, me. You know." He buttoned up his trousers, looked for a comb, and closed the window, which was letting in the cold air. "Don't you need money?" Maigret was suddenly solemn. His gaze became probing, questioning. "I don't know. You don't know whether you need money." Roger darted Maigret a shifty look, and Maigret felt ill at ease. "I don't give a... It's not as if you are earning a good living. I don't earn a bean." He yawned and looked mournfully at his reflection in the mirror. Maigret noticed that Céline had woken up. She didn't move. She must have overheard some of the conversation, for she was watching the 2 men with curiosity. She, too, needed the glass of water and the atmosphere in that untidy room, with its stale smell. Those 2 listless beings was the quintessence of a dispirited world. "Do you have any savings?" Roger was beginning to tire of this conversation. He looked around for his jacket, took out a slim wallet embossed with his initials, and threw it to Maigret. "Have a look. 2 100-franc notes, a few smaller ones, a driving license, and an old cloakroom ticket. What do you intend to do if you are deprived of your inheritance?" "I don't want any inheritance." "You won't contest the will?" "No." That was strange. Maigret, who had been staring at the carpet, looked up. 360,000 francs are enough for you." Then the young man's attitude changed. He walked over to the inspector, stopped within inches of him, at the point where their shoulders were touching, and, his fists clenched, he snarled, "Say that again." At that moment, there was something thuggish about him, a coarse air, the scent of the café brawl. "I'm asking you if Couché's 360,000 francs are—" He just managed to grab Roger's arm in midair. Otherwise, he would have received one of the biggest punches of his life. "Calm down." But Roger was calm. He wasn't struggling. He was pale. He stared fixedly. He was waiting until the inspector was prepared to release him. Was it to strike again? Meanwhile, Celine had jumped out of bed, despite being half naked. Maigret could sense she was about to open the door to call for help. Everything happened peacefully. Maigret only held on to Roger's wrist for a few seconds, and when he gave him back his freedom of movement, the young man did not move. There was a long silence. It was as if each one of them was afraid to break it, the way in a fight. Each opponent is reluctant to deliver the first punch. Finally, it was Roger who spoke. "You've got to be kidding." He picked up a mauve dressing gown from the floor and threw it over to his companion. "Do you want to tell me what you plan to do? Once you've spent your 200 francs, what have I done until now? There's just one little difference. Your father's dead, and you can no longer sponge off him." Roger shrugged, as if to say that Maigret had got the wrong end of the stick. There was an indefinable atmosphere, not exactly of drama, but something else. A poignancy, perhaps. A bohemian atmosphere, but devoid of poetry. Perhaps it was the sight of the wallet and the 2 100-franc notes. Or was it the anxious woman, who had just realized that tomorrow would not be like the previous days, that she'd have to find a new source of support? But no, it was Roger himself who was frightening, because his behavior and actions were out of character, contradicting what Maigret knew of his past, his calmness. And it wasn't an act. He was truly calm, like someone who, "Give me your gun," suddenly commanded the chief inspector. The young man pulled it out of his trouser pocket and proffered it with the ghost of a smile. "Promise me, you'll—" He stopped in mid-sentence when he saw the woman about to scream in terror. She couldn't grasp what was going on, but she knew it was something very bad. Irony. In Roger's eyes. Maigret almost ran out of the room, having nothing further to say, no gesture to make. He beat a retreat, banging into the doorframe on his way out and stifling a curse. Back in the street, his cheery mood of that morning had dissipated. He no longer found life a joke. He looked up at the couple's window. It was closed. You couldn't see a thing. He was uneasy, as one is when nothing makes sense anymore. Roger had given him 2 or 3 looks. He couldn't have explained it, but they were not the looks he was expecting. They were looks that were somehow at odds with the rest. He retraced his steps, because he had forgotten to ask at the hotel for Nine's new address. "Don't know," said the porter. "She paid for her room and left carrying her suitcase. Didn't need a taxi. She must have gone to the cheapest hotel around here. Look, if anything were to happen here, yes, something unexpected, would you kindly inform me personally at police headquarters, Detective Chief Inspector Maigret." He was annoyed at himself for having said that. What could happen? Even so, he recalled the 2 100-franc notes in Roger's wallet and Celine's look of fear. A quarter of an hour later, he entered the Moulin Bleu via the stage door. The auditorium was empty, dark. The seats and the sides of the boxes covered in glossy green silk fabric. On the stage, 6 women, shivering despite their coats, were repeatedly rehearsing the same step, a ridiculously easy step, while a short, pudgy man bellowed a tune at the top of his lungs. 1, 2, tra-la-la-la. No, tra-la-la-la. 3, 3, for heaven's sake. 9 was the second woman in the line. She recognized Maigret, who was standing by a column. The man had spotted him too, but he wasn't bothered. 1, 2, tra-la-la. It went on for 15 minutes. It was colder in here than outside, and Maigret's feet were frozen. At last, the squat man wiped his forehead and cursed his dancers by way of a farewell. "Come to see me," he yelled at Maigret from a distance. "No, I've come to see—" Nine walked over, embarrassed, wondering whether she should hold out her hand to the inspector. "I have some important news for you. Not here. We're not allowed to have visitors at the theater, except in the evenings, because they have to pay." They sat at a pedestal table in a little bar next door. They found Couchet's will. He left his fortune to 3 women. She looked at him in amazement, without suspecting the truth. First of all, his first wife, even though she's remarried, then his second wife, and then you. She continued to stare at Maigret, who saw her pupils dilate and then mist over. And finally she buried her face in her hands to cry. Chapter 8. He had heart disease. He knew it. Nine sipped her ruby-colored aperitif. That's why he took things easy. He said he'd worked enough, that it was time for him to enjoy life. Did he sometimes talk about death? Often, but not. Not that kind of death. He was thinking of his heart disease. They were in one of those little bars where all the customers are regulars. The owner watched Maigret covertly, as if he were a bourgeois meeting his mistress. At the counter, the men were talking about the afternoon's racing. Was he sad? It's hard to explain, because he wasn't like other men. For example, when we were at the theater, or somewhere else, he'd be enjoying himself. Then, for no reason, he'd say with a deep laugh, "Life's a bitch, isn't it, Ninette?" Did he take care of his son? No. Did he talk about him? Almost never. Only when he came to scrounge. And what did he say? He'd sigh. What a stupid idiot. Maigret had already intuited that. For one reason or another, Couchet had little affection for his son. It even seemed as if he was disgusted by the young man. Disgusted to the point of not trying to come to his rescue, for he had never lectured him, and he gave him money to get rid of him, or out of pity. "Waiter, how much do I owe you?" 4 francs 60. Nine left the bar with him, and they stood on the pavement of Rue Fontaine for a moment. "Where are you living now?" "Rue Le Pic, the first hotel on the left. I haven't even looked at the name yet. It's fairly clean. When you're rich, you'll be able—" She gave him a watery smile. "You know very well I'll never be rich. I'm not the sort for all that." The strangest thing was that Maigret had that very impression. Nine didn't look like someone who would be rich one day. He couldn't have said why. "I'll accompany you to Place Pigalle, where I'm going to get my tram." "Skoken." They walked slowly, Maigret huge, burly, and Nine petite next to his broad back. If you knew how lost I feel being on my own. Luckily, there's the theater, with 2 rehearsals a day until the show opens. She had to take 2 steps to each of Maigret's strides, and was almost running. At the corner of Rue Pigalle, she stopped abruptly, while the inspector frowned and muttered under his breath, "The fool!" But they couldn't see anything. Opposite Hotel Pigalle, around 40 people were gathered. A police officer stood in the doorway, trying to move them on. That was all. But there was that particular atmosphere, that silence that you only encounter in the street when a tragedy occurs. "What's going on?" stammered Nine. "In my hotel." "No, it's nothing. Go back to your room." "But something." "Go," he snapped. And she obeyed. scared, while Maigret elbowed his way through the crowd. He charged like a ram. Women shouted abuse at him. The police sergeant recognized him and asked him to step inside the hotel. The district detective chief inspector was already there, talking to the porter, who cried out, pointing at Maigret. "It's him, I recognize him." The two inspectors shook hands. From the little lounge that opened off the lobby, sobs, groans, and indistinct murmurs could be heard. "How did he do it?" asked Maigret. "The girl who lives with him states that he was standing by the window, very calm. She got dressed, and he watched her, whistling. He only paused to tell her she had lovely thighs, but that her calves were too thin. Then he started whistling again, and suddenly everything went quiet. She felt a terrible emptiness. He was no longer there. He couldn't have left via the door. Got it. Did he injure anyone as he landed on the pavement? No one. Killed outright. Spine broken in 2 places. "Here's the ambulance," announced the sergeant coming over to them, and the district detective chief inspector explained to Maigret, "There's nothing more to be done. Do you know whether he has any family who need to be informed?" When you arrived, the porter was just telling me that the young man had had a visitor this morning, a tall, well-built man. He was giving me a description of this man when you turned up. It was you. Should I write a report anyway? Or will you deal with everything? Write a report. What about the family? I'll deal with them. He opened the door to the lounge, saw a shape lying on the floor, completely covered with a blanket from one of the beds. Celine, crumpled in an armchair, was now making a regular wailing noise, while a plump woman, the owner or the manager, was trying to comfort her. "It's not as if he killed himself for you, is it? It's not your fault. You never refused him anything." Maigret did not lift up the blanket, did not even make Celine aware of his presence. A few moments later, the body was carried out to the ambulance, which set off in the direction of the mortuary. Then, gradually, the crowd in Rue Pigalle dispersed. The last stragglers didn't even know whether there had been a fire, a suicide, or the arrest of a pickpocket. He was whistling, and suddenly everything went quiet. Slowly, Maigret climbed the staircase of the Place des Vosges, and, as he reached the 2nd floor, he scowled. Old Mathilde's door was ajar. She was probably lurking behind it, spying. But he shrugged and pulled the bell cord by the Martins' front door. He had his pipe in his mouth. For a second, he considered putting it in his pocket. Then, once again, he shrugged. The sound of bottles clinking, a vague murmur, 2 male voices coming closer, and at last the door opened. "Very good. Doctor?" "Yes. Doctor?" "Thank you. Doctor." A crushed Monsieur Martin, who had not yet had time to get dressed, and whom Maigret found in the same sorry get-up as that morning. "It's you." The doctor headed for the staircase while Monsieur Martin showed the inspector in, glancing furtively in the direction of the bedroom. "Is she worse?" "We don't know. The doctor won't say. He'll be back this evening." He picked up a prescription that was lying on top of the wireless and stared at it with vacant eyes. "I don't even have anyone to send to the pharmacy. What happened? More or less the same as last night, but more violent." She began shivering, mumbling incoherently. "I sent for the doctor, and he tells me she has a temperature of nearly 40. Is she delirious? You can't understand anything she says. I tell you, we need ice and a rubber pouch to place on her forehead. Do you want me to stay here while you go to the pharmacy? Monsieur Martin was about to say no. Then he resigned himself. He put on an overcoat and left, gesticulating, a tragic and grotesque figure, and then came back because he had forgotten to take any money. Maigret had no ulterior motive for remaining in the apartment. He showed no interest in anything, didn't open a single drawer, didn't even glance at a pile of correspondence sitting on a table. He could hear the patient's irregular breathing. From time to time, she gave a long sigh, then babbled a jumble of syllables. When Monsieur Martin came back, he found him in the same spot. Have you got everything you need? Yes. This is terrible. And I haven't even let my office know. Maigret helped him break up the ice and put it in a red rubber pouch. And yet, you didn't have any visitors this morning. Nobody. And you didn't receive any letters. Nothing. Circulars. Madame Martin's forehead was perspiring, and her graying hair was plastered to her temples. Her lips were pale, but her eyes remained extraordinarily alert. Did they recognize Maigret, who was holding the ice-filled pouch on her forehead? It was impossible to say, but she seemed to have quietened down a little. She lay still, with the red pouch on her forehead, staring at the ceiling. The inspector led Monsieur Martin into the dining room. I've got several pieces of news for you. Oh, he said with a shiver of anxiety. Couchet's will has been found. He has left 1/3 of his fortune to your wife. What? And the civil servant floundered, panic-stricken, overwhelmed by this news. You say he's left us 1/3 of his fortune. It's likely that things won't be straightforward. His second wife will probably contest the will, because she only receives 1/3, too. The last third goes to another person. Couchet's most recent mistress, a certain 9. Why did Martin seem so crestfallen? Worse than crestfallen. Devastated. As if his arms and legs had been severed. He stared fixedly at the floor, unable to regain his composure. The second piece of news is not so good. It concerns your stepson, Roger. He committed suicide this morning by jumping out of the window of his room in Rue Pigalle. Then he saw the petty official's hackles rise, as he shot him a look of anger, of rage, and shouted, "So? What are you telling me? You're trying to drive me mad, aren't you? Admit that all this is a trick to get me to talk. Not so loud, your wife. I don't care. You're lying. It isn't possible." He was unrecognizable. In one fell swoop, his shyness, the good manners that were of such importance to him, had all deserted him. It was strange to see his face distraught, his lips quivering, and his hands waving around in mid-air. "I swear to you," said Maigret, "that both items of news are official. But why would he have done that, I tell you? It's enough to drive a person insane. Actually, that's what's happening. My wife is going mad. You've seen her. And if this goes on, I'll end up going mad, too. We'll all go mad." His eyes were darting around wildly. He had lost all self-control. Her son, jumping out of the window, and the will. His features were tense, and suddenly he burst into tears. It was tragic, comical, horrible. Please do calm down. An entire lifetime. 32 years. Every day. At 9 o'clock. Never a foot wrong. All that for? Please, remember your wife can hear you, and that she's very unwell. What about me? Do you think I'm not unwell too? Do you think I could stand such a life for long? He didn't look the sort to cry, and that made his tears all the more poignant. It's nothing to do with you, is it? He's only your stepson. He's not your responsibility. Martin looked at the chief inspector, suddenly calm, but not for long. He's not my responsibility. He flew off the handle. Even so, I'm the one who has to deal with all the trouble. You dare to come here telling these stories on the stairs. The residents give me strange looks, and I bet they suspect me of killing that couché. Absolutely, and anyway, how do I know you don't suspect me as well? What do you want with us? Huh. You don't answer. You wouldn't dare answer. People choose the weakest. A man who's unable to defend himself. And my wife is sick. And as he gesticulated, he banged the wireless with his elbow. It wobbled and crashed onto the floor amid a tinkle of broken bulbs. Then the petty official resurfaced. That wireless cost 1,200 francs. I saved up for 3 years to buy it. A groan came from the bedroom next door. He listened out, but didn't move. Does your wife need anything? It was Maigret who put his head inside the bedroom. Madame Martin was still in bed. The inspector met her gaze and would have been unable to say whether it was a look of acute intelligence or one clouded by fever. She did not attempt to speak, but let him go. In the dining room, Martin was resting both elbows on a dresser, holding his head in his hands and staring at the wallpaper. A few centimeters from his face. Why would he kill himself? Suppose, for example, that it was he who... Silence, a crackling, a strong smell of burning. Martin hadn't noticed. Is there something on the stove? Asked Maigret. He went into the kitchen, blue with steam. On the gas ring, he found a milk pan whose contents had boiled over and which was about to explode. He turned off the gas, opened the window, and caught a glimpse of the courtyard. Dr. Riviere's serums laboratory. The director's car parked in front of the porch, and he could hear the clatter of typewriters in the offices. If Maigret was lingering, it was not without a reason. He wanted to give Martin the time to calm down, even to decide on an attitude to adopt. He slowly filled his pipe and lit it with an igniter hanging above the gas stove. When he came back into the dining room, the man had not budged, but he was calmer. He straightened up with a sigh, fumbled for a handkerchief, and blew his nose loudly. All this is going to end badly, isn't it? He began. There are already 2 dead, replied Maigret. 2 dead. An effort. An effort that must have been extremely harrowing. But Martin, who was about to get all agitated again, managed to remain composed. In that case, I think it would be best. Maigret barely dared speak. He held his breath. He felt a pang in his chest, for he sensed he was close to the truth. Yes, groaned Martin to himself. Too bad it's essential. Essential. But then he walked automatically over to the door of the bedroom and looked deep into the room. Maigret was still waiting, motionless, not saying a word. Martin said nothing. His wife remained silent, but something must have been happening. The situation dragged on and on. The inspector was growing impatient. Well, Martin turned slowly towards him, with a different face. What? You were saying that, Monsieur Martin tried to smile. That what? That it was best to avert any further tragedies. That it was best to what? He wiped his hand across his forehead, like someone finding it difficult to remember. Please forgive me, I'm so distraught that you have forgotten what you wanted to say. Yes, I don't remember. Look, she's asleep. He pointed to Madame Martin, who had closed her eyes and whose face had turned purple, probably from the ice being applied to her forehead. What do you know? Asked Maigret in the tone he used for smart-aleck prisoners. Me. And from then on, all his answers were in that vein. What's known as acting dumb, repeating a word in astonishment. You were on the point of telling me the truth. The truth. Come on, don't try and pretend you're an idiot. You know who killed Couchet. Me? I know. If he had never been given a clout, he was within a whisker of receiving an almighty one from Maigret's hand. Maigret, his jaws clenched, watched the unmoving woman who was asleep, or pretending to be. Then the man whose eyelids were still puffy from the previous outburst, his features drawn, his mustache drooping. Will you take responsibility for what might happen? What might happen? You're wrong, Martin. Wrong how? What was going on? For a minute, perhaps, the man who had been about to speak had stood between the two rooms, his eyes riveted on his wife's bed. Maigret had not heard a sound. Martin had not moved. Now she was asleep, and he was feigning innocence. Forgive me? I think there are moments when I don't know what I'm saying. Admit that a person can go mad if, all the same, he remained sad, lugubrious even. He had the attitude of a condemned man. His gaze avoided Maigret's face, fluttered over familiar objects, and finally settled on the wireless set, which he proceeded to pick up, crouched on the floor, his back to the inspector. What time will the doctor be coming? I don't know. He said this evening. Maigret left, slamming the door behind him. He found himself nose to nose with old Matilda, who got such a fright that she stood transfixed, her mouth open. You haven't anything to tell me either, have you? Eh? Perhaps you're going to claim you don't know anything either. She tried to compose herself. She had both hands beneath her apron in the classic pose of an elderly housewife. Come, and let's go back to your room. Her felt slippers glided over the floorboards. She paused, reluctant to push her half-open door. Go on. Go inside. And Maigret followed her in, kicked the door shut, not even sparing a glance for the madwoman sitting by the window. Now, talk. Understood. And he sank with his full weight onto a chair. Chapter 9. The man who killed a man with a pen. You sit in the room where you made your name, but tonight, it's like a coffin filled with manuscripts that no one dares to read. On the table was a letter from Louise, tucked in the spine of the novel you had rejected. The paper was thin, the handwriting shaky, as if written in haste after a shock that her hand had not yet recovered from. If you are reading this, I am gone. I used to think darkness was just the absence of light, but now I understand. It is something that can be replicated. And you, Chabal, are the one who created it. You read it 3 times, but you don't understand it all. Or rather, you don't want to understand it. Outside the window, Paris was still drenched in rain. The distant sound of trams echoed like the second hand of a giant clock counting down to collapse. You turn on the light and read her old manuscript, chapter by chapter, page by page. There are parts that seem like novels, but when you read them with today's eyes, you see yourself there. No name, no features, just a man who always smokes behind people's backs and never touches anyone with his bare hands. You take the bottle of wine, not to get drunk, but to stop shaking. In the cupboard, an old black and white photo. Louise at a reading, her eyes on you. No affection, no hatred, just awareness. She knew. But why not leave? Why stay in your shadow? Almost midnight. There was a knock at the door. You picked up a pen, an old habit when you felt threatened. A young man, thin, his face haggard, as if he had never eaten properly. I am Leon. I was Louise's student. You don't answer. Leon walks in, puts an old cassette tape on the table. No explanation, just says, she sent me this a week before she died. She said if one day anyone tries to rewrite the truth, give this tape to the person who is writing it. You don't want to turn on the tape, but you don't dare not. Inside was the sound of rain, real rain, and Louise's voice, low, hoarse. And at the end of the tape, you can deny me, deny love, deny yourself. But your voice, Shabbat, I have recorded. And if I die with proof. You break out in a cold sweat. You don't remember ever threatening her, not verbally. But what if your own memory betrays you? What if you write something down and then believe it never existed? Leon said nothing more. He left like a puppet with a missing string. You sit back in the room with the tape, the letter, and the shadow on the wall that doesn't match the movements of your hand. It stands askew. It writes before you write. It looks at you with Louise's eyes. You think maybe Louise's killer wasn't anyone at all. It was another version of you, a version nurtured by willful oblivion. Chapter 10. The Faceless Painter. The next morning, Paris was as damp as a memory. You wake up at 5:47. No alarm. It feels awkward, as if someone has been rearranging the furniture in your head while you sleep. You pick up the newspaper, not to read it, just to keep your hands from shaking. On Louise's old piece of paper was a name, Jules Normand, a book illustrator who worked with her. Supposedly, the last person to see Louise the night before she disappeared. You remember hearing this name, then deliberately forgot. Jules lives in a half-flat near the Gare du Nord, where trains come and go like the breath of people fleeing themselves. You knock on the door, not hard. Don't want to wake someone who might be sleeping on drugs or fear. The door opened. A bald man, an old sweater, and eyes as dim as scratched glasses. Jules looked at his friend, then said, as if he had been waiting for him, "You're here? I've been drawing you every night." You walk in, no questions asked. Dozens of pictures on the walls. All the same scene, a dark room. A man standing across from a woman. The woman is present. The man is not. I don't remember what happened that night, Jules said hoarsely. I just remember her crying and a long shadow across the ceiling. The doctor said I had a concussion, but I think I was erased. You look closely at each picture. There are repeating details of broken glass, a red light bulb, a fox fur hat draped over a chair. Details no one told him, but only those who were there could see. You asked, "Are you sure no one described that room to you?" Jules smiled faintly, not bothering to reply. You take out an old photo from your pocket. Louise and you at the book launch. Ask, "Do you recognize anyone?" Jules looked. A long time. The woman. Yes, it is her. The person next to her. No, I have never seen her. That face does not match the person in the painting. You froze. Jules is not lying, not confused, not paranoid. In your mind, a small crack opens. If the person in the painting is you, but the person in real life doesn't match the witness's memory, then who is real? You look closely at the bigger picture. Behind the faceless man was a typewriter, on which was printed a line, "Every manuscript is a crime scene." And the writer always leaves fingerprints. You leave the apartment. The painting is in your hands. Not because you want to keep it, but because it remembers for you what you dare not remember. That night, you stand in front of the mirror and try calling your name out loud. The first time, it didn't echo. Chapter 11. 2. Layers of Memory. You sit in an old cafe near the Place de la République. It is empty, as if everyone who used to come here has withdrawn from real life. On the table, a brown envelope, no postmark, no sender. Inside, a typewritten manuscript. Yellow paper. Hand-aligned margins, the kind of thing real writers do. Not word processors. Manuscript title, "The Corridor with the Sound of Crying." Author not listed, but the writing style. You recognize it immediately. Louise, you turn the first page. The story is about a woman named Elle who works in publishing. She discovers that a colleague, also her ex-lover, is writing a novel based on her own life, without permission, without acknowledgement. He writes as if I were raw material. I live, and he extracts every breath to fill his plot, every chapter. I die a second time, on paper. You read on, your heart clenched, not because of the content, but because it was so terrifyingly similar to what had happened in real life. Louise writes in detail of an argument in an apartment with a west-facing window, where a red light flickered through the night. Then she wrote, "That night, I knew I had no right to remember, because if I did, he would write it down. And when his story was good enough, people would believe him more than me." You stop at the last chapter. Louise tells about Elle's death, but doesn't specify whether it was suicide or murder. Only this paragraph: that man lives in 2 layers of memories. One is his, one is mine, twisted into a novel. He is a writer, but also a criminal. And the keyboard is the coldest scalpel. You sit still, not knowing if you are a reader or a defendant. You write for years, published dozens of books. How many of those are things you remember? And how many are other people's memories you've stolen, then rewritten, then believed to be yours? You fold the manuscript. Your hands are stained with ink. Not printer's ink, fresh ink. As if the last page hadn't dried yet. You turn it over, and there's a line written in blue ink, mixed in with the dialogue. If you're reading this, I'm still in your head, and I won't be silent anymore. You leave the bar with the manuscript and a decision. You must rewrite the truth one last time, even if it destroys you. Chapter 12. The Writers from the Head. You return to the apartment at 2:00 a.m. Paris is asleep. Only you remain, and the manuscript of a dead man who continues to write. You sit at the table, no coffee, no alcohol, just the old typewriter, the kind you keep around to keep the real feel. You put the paper in, your fingers tremble, and then crack, crack, crack. The first 3 letters appear. Not what you typed, but they appear anyway. I'm Louise. You stop. Your breath is short, like you've just run from a dream with a knife in it. You check the cord, the desk lamp, even the keyboard. Everything is still old, still scratched, still inanimate. But then you sit down, put your hands on the keyboard, and this time you actively type. I am Shabad. I write the truth. I am not afraid. Machine response. You never wrote the truth. You just edited other people's memories. But I remember. You sweat, pull out the paper. It's blank. Everything you see is in your head. You haven't typed a single key yet. You gasp. Stand up. Look in the mirror. Your face doesn't match your memories. Your chin is squarer. The old scar on your forehead is gone. You quickly flip through Louise's manuscript to check the description of the killer and read what she wrote. I don't fear death. I fear being rewritten by the hand of the man I once loved and feared. You start writing. No thinking, no pausing. The words flow like blood. You don't choose the words. They choose you. And then you find yourself writing, I killed her. But I don't remember. I wrote down what you said, word for word. But I don't know if it was true. I live in 2 layers of memories, and now I'm not sure which layer I'm on. Outside the window, a light knock. You don't open. You know who's standing there. It's not Louise. It's not the police. It's the shadow you cast, the writer in your head, the one who finished the novel before you even started. You leave the table. The light stays on the typewriter. A line just appeared, even though no one had typed it. The next chapter is no longer yours. Chapter 13, the manuscript that only the killer knows. There was no sun in the morning. No one called. No one knocked on the door. There was only a large white envelope lying in front of the apartment door. No stamp, no sender, no footprints in the hallway. You pick it up and open it. Inside A4 printed manuscript. No title, no author's name, no introduction. But right on the first page is the opening line. I did not die of despair. I died of being rewritten. You flip it over. The story is a perfect reconstruction of the night Louise disappeared. Every detail is exactly like the room you lived in. Every line of dialogue, including the words you remember never saying. He said, I don't need you alive. I just need your character. That's not in any of the books, but I heard it. You slump down in your chair. Memories begin to flood in like a tide. First as a vague feeling, then as an image. Finally, as your own voice, saying words you should never have said. You turn on the radio, needing something to drown out your thoughts. No music, just news. This morning, a newspaper in the 9th arrondissement received a manuscript signed Louise Verneuil, a document that is considered literary evidence for an unsolved murder. The Paris police are currently investigating. The last person to have had contact with Miss Verneuil was the writer Charles Chabot. You vomit, not from fear, from the feeling of being exposed not by evidence, but by words. Every sentence in this manuscript seems to be staring back at you. Then the doorbell rang. This time, not darkness. Police. You open the door. In front of you is Inspector Maigret. Someone you knew from his book review days. His voice was even, almost regretful. It seems she left the last one for you, but sent us a copy. You are silent. Moral doesn't need handcuffs. You don't resist. You will come with me, for now, to verify. But I'm afraid you will be the one who has to prove that you did not write that death. On your desk, the typewriter is still on. The last page turned gently in the wind from the window. A line of words appeared in red ink, very small, very sharp. Go on, Shabad. The last chapter is a confession I dare not remember. Chapter 14. The Signature of the Dead. The interrogation room on the 3rd floor of the 9th District Police Station is not like the novel you wrote. No harsh ceiling lights. No shouting, Inspector. Just a small room. Cold metal chairs. And 2 men, you and Morrill, facing each other over cold coffee. Morrill placed the manuscript on the table. No words, no pressure. You look at it as if you have just met a well-buried relative. You say, very slowly, I didn't write this. Morrill pointed to the last page. Louise's signature. The paper, your fingerprint. The ink matches the ribbon in your typewriter. You bow your head. It's all true. And that's what scares you more than the accusation. What about the handwriting, you ask? Does it match mine? Morrill breathed a sigh of relief. He pulled out an appraisal report from his briefcase. No, not your handwriting. You look up. That's not a release. It is a crypt that opens the door to greater doubt. If it is not you who writes, then who? Morrill placed a photograph on the table. Louise, sitting in her study, next to her typewriter. Date taken 3 days before her death. You look at the photo, then look at the manuscript. The seating position. The light coming through the window. Exactly like the scene described in the last chapter. You don't know anyone close enough to Louise to write it down exactly like that. No one. Except you. Do you know? Morrill said, his voice low. There is a passage in the manuscript that describes the exact location of a mole on Louise's back, which is not in any of the photographs. Nor is it recorded in the forensic records. You are silent. I don't ask how you know. Morrill continued. I ask, why does that manuscript know? You think back to the night Louise disappeared. You were home. You were drinking. You don't remember clearly, or rather you only remember what you allow yourself to remember. Morrill gathered his documents and stood up. No charges have been filed yet, but you are not to leave the city. And if you have anything to add, write it down. He leaves, leaving you alone with the manuscript. You pick up the manuscript, reading it for the first time as a stranger. The last page has a handwritten line in purple ink. If I die, you will get to write the last chapter. But if I live, I will rewrite your whole life, Chabot. You look out the window. It's dark, no lights. Just your face reflected in the glass, and a faint smile. Not yours. Chapter 15. Letter to the Unnamed Person. Louise's old apartment was located in an alley behind the St. Ambroise Church, where streetlights rarely penetrated at night. You had the key, or rather, still had it. Louise never asked for it back, or she believed you wouldn't come back. You walk in. No lights on. Everything is as it was when she was last alive. But the room doesn't smell like her. Just dust and rotten paper. You know she used to keep her handwritten letters, drafts, and unfinished pages in a black tin box in the bottom shelf of her bookcase, behind her Russian novels. You find the box, The lock is rusty. You pry it open with your fingernails, without hesitation. Inside were dozens of sheets of paper, neatly arranged. The writing was slightly slanted, heart-wrenchingly familiar. You flip through the letters. Most of them are to yourself. Never sent. Blame, anger, despair. I no longer write for the truth. I write to control reality. You don't read me. You proofread me. You thought you were used to pain, but not used to being skinned by the words of the one you used to love. And then you see it, a small letter, folded 3 times, paper yellower than the others, envelope marked MC. No address, no date. You open it, first line. If you read this letter, it means I didn't send it. Next line. You say you are not Charles Chabot, but you are not someone else either. You are the middleman, and I do not know what your true face is. You skim the bottom. The more you read, the deeper your heart sinks into a bottomless abyss of memories. Louise writes about someone who has appeared in her life like a ghost, someone who knows everything she writes, someone who says that words have no right to ownership, only to exist. Conclusion. I began to suspect maybe he was writing for me. Or worse, I was just a character he created. If I disappear, look for him. His name is MC, and I don't know if that stands for Morel Chabot himself. You are stunned. You never knew anyone named MC, and you never told Louise that Morel used to write under the pen name MC when he was young. In your mind, a cold light ran down your spine. If Morel had been a writer, if he had known you, if he had somehow written Louise's ending, the person who killed her not only held a knife, but also a pen. You leave the apartment with a letter and a name, no longer a suspect, but the last living clue. Chapter 16. 2 people write an ending. You meet Morel at an old bar called La Résine, which was once a hangout for post-war writers and is now a drinking den for those who can no longer write. Morel arrived on time. Same old leather jacket. Same calm demeanor of someone used to watching people confess. You don't beat around the bush. You used to write under the pen name MC. Right. Morel sipped his wine. No surprise. No denial. And then I quit. I realized I had no material to write about. Only the ability to make other people write until they fall apart. You place Louise's letter on the table. The paper is flat, but the words ripple like the waves of a night sea. She wrote to him, or thought she was writing to him, or about someone she believed didn't exist. Morel nodded slightly. Maybe all 3. The thing is, you say the final draft bears her signature, but the handwriting isn't mine, and the ink is on my typewriter, Morel replied, still in the same tone as if he were reading a draft. Because you are no longer the writer. You are the medium. You feel cold from inside your lungs. What do you mean? Morel leaned toward you and pulled a sheet of paper from his pocket. Thin. Typewritten. It's a paragraph. You've never written it. But you recognize it right away. It's your voice. Or what used to be your voice. I started rewriting Louise's memories, not to kill her, but to see if I change every detail. Will she still exist in the reader's memory? You whisper, you tried to kill her by rewriting her. Morel did not object. And you killed her with your silence. Jason, the truth is not who wrote it. It is that they both wrote it. The only difference is you wrote it to keep it. Morel wrote it to erase it. You look him straight in the eye. What about the last chapter? Who will write it? Morrill smiled and poured more wine. I think it's writing itself, and it's using us, like a double-edged pen. You leave the bar. The wind is cold. You have nothing in your hands, but your head is heavy with something. Memories of unknown origin, and an ending that no one can control. Chapter 17. Manuscript without author. A week after your meeting with Morrill, you receive an ash-colored envelope. No return address. No postmark. Just your name written in black ink, in a slanted hand like Louise's, but somehow colder, more mechanical. Inside was a typewritten manuscript, no cover, no author, no preface. It opened with no chapter or title, just one line. All the characters in this story are unaware that they are being written. You sit down and start reading. The story recounts Louise's death, but not as you remember it, not as Morrill tells it. It is the third version. In this version, Louise is not killed. She chooses to die, to escape a reality that she believes was written by Chabot. I leave the page, not because of pain, but because I know I can no longer write with love. The next page recounts Morrill's death. No police, no crime. He was just erased from the manuscript, line by line, word by word. He disappeared like a crossed-out footnote. No one remembered he ever existed. Only a paragraph without a subject remained. Finally, there is Chabot, you, in the empty room, facing a typewriter that still works. Even though you no longer have hands to type, you are a writer, but no longer a story. You are the memory of another writer who has left but has not yet closed the final file. You shiver. Turn the last page. One line only, author unknown. But if you're reading this, you wrote the final chapter. You look around your room, the picture on the wall, gone. The picture of Louise, gone. The typewriter, still there. But the ribbon was torn, as if torn from the inside. You begin to doubt yourself as a character. A character is aware that he or she is being constructed, not by one hand, but by many. You open your notebook, intending to write something, but your hand no longer responds. Your grip on the pen, stiff as printer paper. Your wrist begins to blur, as if erased from the draft. You exclaimed, "I am real. I remember. I lived." But no one answered, just the steady tapping of a typewriter. Wireless. No one. No pause. Chabot disappears in the final sentence, leaving the reader free to rewrite him as they wish. Chapter 18. The Last Reader. The story now turns to you. Not Chabot, not Louise, not Morrill. You, the one holding the manuscript, you don't know how you got it. Maybe you found it. Maybe you sent it by mistake. Or worse, it was always there, waiting for you to open it at the right moment. At first, you just intended to read. Then you thought, I'll edit a few sentences, make it sharper. Then you think, maybe I can continue, give it a clearer ending. Then you start typing. You write the next chapter. Note clearly, carefully, character names, motives, structure. But the more you write, the more you realize that the paragraphs you intended to write are already there. You don't remember writing them, but they have your voice, your structure, your rhythm. You try deleting it. It doesn't work. The file restores the old text, Every time you delete it, it comes back, faster, darker. You check the metadata file. Creator unknown. Last modified 1 minute ago. But you are offline. You type one more line. I am the writer. I decide whether the character lives or dies. Immediately. The text disappeared. Instead, there is another sentence. In a strange font, grayer than usual. The writer does not decide. The writer only records what has happened. You turn on the webcam. No picture. Just a black screen with a faint reflection of text. Don't look. Write. You start shaking. You tear up the printout. Throw it in the trash. Turn off the machine. Unplug it. But in your hands, there is still another manuscript. Simenon. Not print, not file. It's in your head. Every word, every sentence, every ending that you didn't think of, but now can't forget. You go to the mirror, look at it. Your face is reflected, but the features are no longer clear. Your chin, like Chabot. Your eyes, like Morel. The shape of your lips, Louise's. When she said, "You write me with your own loneliness," you type the last line. The last reader does not exist, because by reading this far, they have become the next writer.